Hello, and welcome to Bitesized Audio on YouTube. I'm Simon Stanhope, actor, audiobook narrator, and curator of this channel. On the channel you can hear my narrations, more than 100 to date, and more to come, of classic short stories, mostly from the Victorian and Edwardian eras, including vintage ghost stories, detective stories, and other classic tales of mystery and suspense. To accompany the narrations, I've put a short profile of the authors in the video description, as well as some general background notes on the stories for those who'd like to know more. If you enjoy this content, please hit subscribe, like, share, leave a comment if you'd like to, and thank you for listening. Number 13 by M.R. James. Among the towns of Jutland, Viborg justly holds a high place. It is the seat of a bishopric. It has a handsome, but almost entirely new cathedral, a charming garden, a lake of great beauty and many stalks. Near it is Hald, accounted one of the prettiest things in Denmark, and hard by is Finderup, where Mask Stig murdered King Erik Glipping on St. Cecilia's Day in the year 1286. 56 blows of square-headed iron maces were traced on Erik's skull when his tomb was opened in the 17th century. But I am not writing a guidebook. There are good hotels in Viborg. Preisler's and the Phoenix are all that can be desired. But my cousin, whose experiences I have to tell you now, went to the Golden Lion the first time that he visited Viborg. He has not been there since, and the following pages will perhaps explain the reason of his abstention. The Golden Lion is one of the very few houses in the town that were not destroyed in the Great Fire of 1726, which practically demolished the cathedral, the Sonjakirke, the Radhus, and so much else that was old and interesting. It is a great red brick house, that is, the front is of brick, with corby steps on the gables and a text over the door. But the courtyard into which the omnibus drives is of black and white wood and plaster. The sun was declining in the heavens when my cousin walked up to the door, and the light smote full upon the imposing facade of the house. He was delighted with the old-fashioned aspect of the place, and promised himself a thoroughly satisfactory and amusing stay in an inn so typical of old Jutland. It was not business, in the ordinary sense of the word, that had brought Mr. Anderson to Viborg. He was engaged upon some researches into the church history of Denmark, and it had come to his knowledge that in the Rigsarkiv of Viborg there were papers, saved from the fire, relating to the last days of Roman Catholicism in the country. He proposed, therefore, to spend a considerable time, perhaps as much as a fortnight or 3 weeks, in examining and copying these, and he hoped that the Golden Lion would be able to give him a room of sufficient size to serve alike as a bedroom and a study. His wishes were explained to the landlord, and after a certain amount of thought, the latter suggested that perhaps it might be the best way for the gentleman to look at 1 or 2 of the larger rooms and pick one for himself. It seemed a good idea. The top floor was soon rejected as entailing too much getting upstairs after the day's work. The second floor contained no room of exactly the dimensions required. But on the first floor there was a choice of 2 or 3 rooms, which would, so far as size went, suit admirably. The landlord was strongly in favour of number 17, but Mr. Anderson pointed out that its windows commanded only the blank wall of the next house, and that it would be very dark in the afternoon. Either number 12 or number 14 would be better, for both of them looked on the street, and the bright evening light and the pretty view would more than compensate him for the additional amount of noise. Eventually, number 12 was selected. Like its neighbours, it had 3 windows, all on one side of the room. It was fairly high and unusually long. There was, of course, no fireplace, but the stove was handsome and rather old, a cast-iron erection, on the side of which was a representation of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and the inscription 1 Bogmoser, cap 22, above. Nothing else in the room was remarkable. The only interesting picture was an old coloured print of the town, date about 1820. Supper time was approaching, but when Anderson, refreshed by the ordinary ablutions, descended the staircase, there were still a few minutes before the bell rang. He devoted them to examining the list of his fellow lodgers. As is usual in Denmark, their names were displayed on a large blackboard, divided into columns and lines, the numbers of the rooms being painted in at the beginning of each line. The list was not exciting. There was an advocate, or Saufer, a German, and some bagmen from Copenhagen. The one and only point which suggested any food for thought was the absence of any number 13 from the tale of the rooms, and even this was a thing which Anderson had already noticed 6 times in his experience of Danish hotels. He could not help wondering whether the objection to that particular number, common as it is, was so widespread and so strong as to make it difficult to let a room so ticketed, and he resolved to ask the landlord if he and his colleagues in the profession had actually met with many clients who refused to be accommodated in the 13th room. He had nothing to tell me, I am giving the story as I heard it from him, about what passed at supper, and the evening, which was spent in unpacking and arranging his clothes, books, and papers, was not more eventful. Towards 11 o'clock he resolved to go to bed, but with him, as with a good many other people nowadays, an almost necessary preliminary to bed, if he meant to sleep, was the reading of a few pages of print, and he now remembered that the particular book which he had been reading in the train, and which alone would satisfy him at that present moment, was in the pocket of his greatcoat, then hanging on a peg outside the dining-room. To run down and secure it was the work of a moment, and, as the passages were by no means dark, it was not difficult for him to find his way back to his own door. So at least he thought. But when he arrived there and turned the handle, the door entirely refused to open, and he caught the sound of a hasty movement towards it from within. He had tried the wrong door, of course. Was his own room to the right or to the left? He glanced at the number. It was 13. His room would be on the left, and so it was. And not before he had been in bed for some minutes, had read his wonted 3 or 4 pages of his book, blown out his light, and turned over to go to sleep, did it occur to him that, whereas on the blackboard of the hotel there had been no number 13, there was undoubtedly a room numbered 13 in the hotel. He felt rather sorry he had not chosen it for his own. Perhaps he might have done the landlord a little service by occupying it, and given him the chance of saying that a well-born English gentleman had lived in it for 3 weeks and liked it very much. But probably it was used as a servant's room, or something of the kind. After all, it was most likely not so large or good a room as his own. And he looked drowsily about the room, which was fairly perceptible in the half-light from the street lamp. It was a curious effect, he thought. Rooms usually look larger in a dim light than a full one, but this seemed to have contracted in length and grown proportionately higher. Well, well, sleep was more important than these vague ruminations, and to sleep he went. On the day after his arrival, Anderson attacked the Rigsarchiv of Viborg. He was, as one might expect in Denmark, kindly received, and access to all that he wished to see was made as easy for him as possible. The documents laid before him were far more numerous and interesting than he had at all anticipated. Besides official papers, there was a large bundle of correspondence relating to Bishop Jürgen Fries, the last Roman Catholic who held the see, and in these there cropped up many amusing and what are called intimate details of private life and individual character. There was much talk of a house owned by the bishop but not inhabited by him in the town. Its tenant was apparently somewhat of a scandal and a stumbling block to the reforming party. He was a disgrace, they wrote to the city. He practised secret and wicked arts, and had sold his soul to the enemy. It was of a piece with the gross corruption and superstition of the Babylonish Church that such a viper and blood-sucking trollman should be patronized and harboured by the bishop. The bishop met these reproaches boldly. He protested his own abhorrence of all such things as secret arts, and required his antagonists to bring the matter before the proper court, of course the spiritual court, and sift it to the bottom. No one could be more ready and willing than himself to condemn Magister Nicholas Franken, if the evidence showed him to have been guilty of any of the crimes informally alleged against him. Anderson had not time to do more than glance at the next letter of the Protestant leader Rasmus Nielsen, before the record office was closed for the day. But he gathered its general tenor, which was to the effect that Christian men were now no longer bound by the decisions of bishops of Rome, and that the bishop's court was not and could not be a fit or competent tribunal to judge so grave and weighty a cause. On leaving the office, Mr. Anderson was accompanied by the old gentleman who presided over it, and, as they walked, the conversation very naturally turned to the papers of which I have just been speaking. Herr Scavenius, the archivist of Viborg, though very well informed as to the general run of the documents under his charge, was not a specialist in those of the Reformation period. He was much interested in what Anderson had to tell him about them. He looked forward with great pleasure, he said, to seeing the publication in which Mr. Anderson spoke of embodying their contents. "This house of the Bishop Fries," he added, "it is a great puzzle to me where it can have stood. I have studied carefully the topography of old Viborg, but it is most unlucky. Of the old terrier of the bishop's property, which was made in 1560, and of which we have the greater part in the archive, just the piece which had the list of the town property is missing. Never mind. Perhaps I shall some day succeed to find him." After taking some exercise, I forget exactly how or where, Anderson went back to the Golden Lion, his supper, his game of patience, and his bed. On the way to his room, it occurred to him that he had forgotten to talk to the landlord about the omission of number 13 from the hotel board, and also that he might as well make sure that number 13 did actually exist before he made any reference to the matter. The decision was not difficult to arrive at. There was the door with its number as plain as could be, and work of some kind was evidently going on inside it, for as he neared the door he could hear footsteps and voices, or a voice, within. During the few seconds in which he halted to make sure of the number, the footsteps ceased, seemingly very near the door, and he was a little startled at hearing a quick, hissing breathing, as of a person in strong excitement. He went on to his own room, and again he was surprised to find how much smaller it seemed now than it had when he selected it. It was a slight disappointment, but only slight. If he found it really not large enough, he could very easily shift to another. In the meantime, he wanted something. As far as I remember, it was a pocket handkerchief, out of his portmanteau, which had been placed by the porter on a very inadequate trestle or stool against the wall at the furthest end of the room from his bed. Here was a very curious thing. The portmanteau was not to be seen. It had been moved by officious servants. Doubtless the contents had been put in the wardrobe. No, none of them were there. This was vexatious. The idea of a theft he dismissed at once. Such things rarely happen in Denmark, but some piece of stupidity had certainly been performed, which is not so uncommon, and the stoopee must be severely spoken to. Whatever it was that he wanted, it was not so necessary to his comfort that he could not wait till the morning for it, and he therefore settled not to ring the bell and disturb the servants. He went to the window. The right-hand window it was, and looked out on the quiet street. There was a tall building opposite, with large spaces of dead wall. No passers-by. A dark night, and very little to be seen of any kind. The light was behind him, and he could see his own shadow clearly cast on the opposite wall. Also the shadow of the bearded man in number 11 on the left, who passed to and fro in shirt-sleeves once or twice, and was seen first brushing his hair, and later on in a nightgown. Also the shadow of the occupant of number 13 on the right. This might be more interesting. Number 13 was, like himself, leaning on his elbows on the window-sill, looking out into the street. He seemed to be a tall, thin man. Or was it by any chance a woman? At least, it was someone who covered his or her head with some kind of drapery before going to bed, and, he thought, must be possessed of a red lampshade, and the lamp must be flickering very much. There was a distinct playing up and down of a dull red light on the opposite wall. He craned out a little to see if he could make any more of the figure, but beyond a fold of some light, perhaps white material, on the window-sill, he could see nothing. Now came a distant step in the street, and its approach seemed to recall number 13 to a sense of his exposed position, for very swiftly and suddenly he swept aside from the window, and his red light went out. Anderson, who had been smoking a cigarette, laid the end of it on the window-sill, and went to bed. Next morning he was woken by the stoopee with hot water, etc. He roused himself, and after thinking out the correct Danish words, said, as distinctly as he could, "You must not move my portmanteau. Where is it?" As is not uncommon, the maid laughed and went away without making any distinct answer. Anderson, rather irritated, sat up in bed, intending to call her back, but he remained sitting up, staring straight in front of him. There was his portmanteau on its trestle, exactly where he had seen the porter put it when he first arrived. This was a rude shock for a man who prided himself on his accuracy of observation. How it could possibly have escaped him the night before, he did not pretend to understand. At any rate, there it was now. The daylight showed more than the portmanteau. It let the true proportions of the room with its 3 windows appear, and satisfied its tenant that his choice, after all, had not been a bad one. When he was almost dressed, he walked to the middle one of the 3 windows to look out at the weather. Another shock awaited him. Strangely unobservant he must have been last night. He could have sworn 10 times over that he had been smoking at the right-hand window the last thing before he went to bed. And here was his cigarette end, on the sill of the middle window. He started to go down to breakfast. Rather late, but number 13 was later. Here were his boots, still outside his door. A gentleman's boots. So then number 13 was a man, not a woman. Just then he caught sight of the number on the door. It was 14. He thought he must have passed number 13 without noticing it. 3 stupid mistakes in 12 hours were too much for a methodical, accurate-minded man, so he turned back to make sure. The next number to 14 was number 12, his own room. There was no number 13 at all. After some minutes devoted to a careful consideration of everything he'd had to eat and drink during the last 24 hours, Anderson decided to give the question up. If his eyes or his brain were giving way, he would have plenty of opportunities for ascertaining that fact. If not, then he was evidently being treated to a very interesting experience. In either case, the development of events would certainly be worth watching. During the day, he continued his examination of the episcopal correspondence, which I have already summarized. To his disappointment, it was incomplete. Only one other letter could be found which referred to the affair of Magister Nicholas Franken. It was from the Bishop Jürgen Fries to Rasmus Nielsen. He said, "Although we are not in the least degree inclined to assent to your judgment concerning our court, and shall be prepared, if need be, to withstand you to the uttermost in that behalf, yet forasmuch as our trusty and well-beloved Magister Nicholas Franken, against whom you have dared to allege certain false and malicious charges, hath been suddenly removed from among us, it is apparent that the question for this term falls. But forasmuch as you further allege that the apostle and evangelist St. John, in his heavenly apocalypse, describes the Holy Roman Church under the guise and symbol of the Scarlet Woman, be it known to you," etc. Search as he would, Anderson could find no sequel to this letter, nor any clue to the cause or manner of the removal of the casus belli. He could only suppose that Franken had died suddenly, and as there were only 2 days between the date of Nielsen's last letter, when Franken was evidently still in being, and that of the bishop's letter, the death must have been completely unexpected. In the afternoon he paid a short visit to Halt, and took his tea at Bäcklund. Nor could he notice, though he was in a somewhat nervous frame of mind, that there was any indication of such a failure of eye or brain as his experiences of the morning had led him to fear. At supper he found himself next to the landlord. "What," he asked him, after some indifferent conversation, "is the reason why in most of the hotels one visits in this country the number 13 is left out of the list of rooms? I see you have none here." The landlord seemed amused. "To think that you should have noticed a thing like that. I've thought about it once or twice myself, to tell the truth. An educated man, I've said, has no business with these superstitious notions. I was brought up myself here in the high school of Viborg, and our old master was always a man to set his face against anything of that kind. He's been dead now this many years. A fine upstanding man he was, and ready with his hands as well as his head. I recollect us boys, one snowy day—" Here he plunged into reminiscence. "Then you don't think there is any particular objection to having a number 13, said Anderson. "Ah, to be sure. Well, you understand, I was brought up to the business by my poor old father. He kept an hotel in our house first, and then, when we were born, he moved to Viborg here, which was his native place, and had the Phoenix here until he died. That was in 1876. Then I started business in Silkeborg, and only the year before last I moved into this house." Then followed more details as to the state of the house and business when first taken over. "And when you came here, was there a number 13? No, I was going to tell you about that. You see, in a place like this, the commercial class, the travellers, are what we have to provide for in general. And put them in number 13, why, they'd as soon sleep in the street, or sooner. As far as I'm concerned myself, it wouldn't make a penny difference to me what the number of my room was, and so I've often said to them, but they stick to it that it brings them bad luck. Quantities of stories they have among them of men that have slept in a number 13 and never been the same again, or lost their best customers, or one thing and another, said the landlord, after searching for a more graphic phrase. Then what do you use your number 13 for? Said Anderson, conscious, as he said the words, of a curious anxiety, quite disproportionate to the importance of the question. My number 13? Why don't I tell you that there isn't such a thing in the house? I thought you might have noticed that. If there was, it would be next door to your own room. Well, yes, only I happened to think... That is, I fancied last night that I had seen a door numbered 13 in that passage, and really I am almost certain I must have been right, for I saw it the night before as well. Of course, Herr Christensen laughed this notion to scorn, as Anderson had expected, and emphasized with much iteration the fact that no number 13 existed, or had existed before him in that hotel. Anderson was in some ways relieved by his certainty, but still puzzled, and he began to think that the best way to make sure whether he had indeed been subject to an illusion or not was to invite the landlord to his room to smoke a cigar later on in the evening. Some photographs of English towns which he had with him formed a sufficiently good excuse. Herr Christensen was flattered by the invitation, and most willingly accepted it. At about 10 o'clock he was to make his appearance, but before that Anderson had some letters to write, and retired for the purpose of writing them. He almost blushed to himself at confessing it, but he could not deny that it was the fact that he was becoming quite nervous about the question of the existence of number 13. So much so that he approached his room by way of number 11, in order that he might not be obliged to pass the door, or the place where the door ought to be. He looked quickly and suspiciously about the room when he entered it, but there was nothing, beyond that indefinable air of being smaller than usual, to warrant any misgivings. There was no question of the presence or absence of his portmanteau tonight. He had himself emptied it of its contents, and lodged it under his bed. With a certain effort he dismissed the thought of number 13 from his mind, and sat down to his writing. His neighbours were quiet enough. Occasionally a door opened in the passage, and a pair of boots was thrown out, or a bagman walked past, humming to himself, and outside, from time to time, a cart thundered over the atrocious cobblestones, or a quick step hurried along the flags. Anderson finished his letters, ordered in whisky and soda, and then went to the windows, and studied the dead wall opposite, and the shadows upon it. As far as he could remember, number 14 had been occupied by the lawyer, a staid man, who said little at meals, being generally engaged in studying a small bundle of papers beside his plate. Apparently, however, he was in the habit of giving vent to his animal spirits when alone. Why else should he be dancing? The shadow from the next room evidently showed that he was. Again and again his thin form crossed the window, his arms waved, and a gaunt leg was kicked up with surprising agility. He seemed to be bare-footed, and the floor must be well laid, for no sound betrayed his movements. Sauführer Herr Anders Jensen, dancing at 10 o'clock at night in an hotel bedroom, seemed a fitting subject for a historical painting in the grand style, and Anderson's thoughts, like those of Emily in the Mysteries of Udolpho, began to arrange themselves in the following lines. When I return to my hotel at 10 o'clock p.m., the waiters think I am unwell. I do not care for them. But when I've locked my chamber door and put my boots outside, I dance all night upon the floor. And even if my neighbours swore, I'd go on dancing all the more, for I'm acquainted with the law, and in despite of all their jaw, their protests I deride. Had not the landlord at this moment knocked at the door, it is probable that quite a long poem might have been laid before the reader. To judge from his look of surprise when he found himself in the room, Herr Christensen was struck, as Anderson had been, by something unusual in its aspect. But he made no remark. Anderson's photographs interested him mightily, and formed the text of many autobiographical discourses. Nor is it quite clear how the conversation could have been diverted into the desired channel of number 13, had not the lawyer at this moment begun to sing, and to sing in a manner which could leave no doubt in anyone's mind that he was either exceedingly drunk or raving mad. It was a high, thin voice that they heard, and it seemed dry, as if from long disuse. Of words or tune there was no question. It went sailing up to a surprising height, and was carried down with a despairing moan, as of a winter wind in a hollow chimney, or an organ whose wind fails suddenly. It was a really horrible sound, and Anderson felt that if he had been alone, he must have fled for refuge and society to some neighbour bagman's room. The landlord sat open-mouthed. "I don't understand it," he said at last, wiping his forehead. "It is dreadful. I have heard it once before, but I made sure it was a cat." "Is he mad?" said Anderson. "He must be. And what a sad thing. Such a good customer, too, and so successful in his business by what I hear, and a young family to bring up." Just then came an impatient knock at the door, and the knocker entered without waiting to be asked. It was the lawyer, in déshabillé, and very rough-haired, and very angry he looked. "I beg pardon, sir," he said, "but I should be much obliged if you would kindly desist." Here he stopped, for it was evident that neither of the persons before him was responsible for the disturbance, and after a moment's lull, it swelled forth again, more wildly than before. "But what in the name of heaven does it mean?" broke out the lawyer. "Where is it? Who is it? Am I going out of my mind?" "Surely, Herr Jensen, it comes from your room next door. Isn't there a cat or something stuck in the chimney?" This was the best that occurred to Anderson to say, and he realized its futility as he spoke. But anything was better than to stand and listen to that horrible voice, and look at the broad, white face of the landlord, all perspiring and quivering as he clutched the arms of his chair. "Impossible," said the lawyer. "Impossible. There is no chimney. I came here because I was convinced the noise was going on here. It was certainly in the next room to mine." "Was there no door between yours and mine?" said Anderson eagerly. "No, sir," said Herr Jensen, rather sharply. "At least, not this morning." "Ah," said Anderson. "Nor tonight?" "I am not sure," said the lawyer, with some hesitation. Suddenly, the crying or singing voice in the next room died away, and the singer was heard, seemingly to laugh to himself, in a crooning manner. The three men actually shivered at the sound. Then there was a silence. "Come," said the lawyer, "What have you to say, Herr Christensen? What does this mean?" "Good heaven!" said Christensen. "How should I tell? I know no more than you, gentlemen. I pray I may never hear such a noise again." "So do I," said Herr Jensen, and he added something under his breath. Anderson thought it sounded like the last words of the Psalter, "Omnis spiritus laudet Dominum," but he could not be sure. "But we must do something," said Anderson. "The three of us. Shall we go and investigate in the next room?" "But that is Herr Jensen's room," wailed the landlord. "It is no use. He has come from there himself." "I am not so sure," said Jensen. "I think this gentleman is right. We must go and see." The only weapons of defence that could be mustered on the spot were a stick and umbrella. The expedition went out into the passage, not without quakings. There was a deadly quiet outside, but a light shone from under the next door. Anderson and Jensen approached it. The latter turned the handle and gave a sudden vigorous push. No use. The door stood fast. "Herr Christensen," said Jensen, "will you go and fetch the strongest servant you have in the place? We must see this through." The landlord nodded and hurried off, glad to be away from the scene of action. Jensen and Anderson remained outside, looking at the door. "It is number 13, you see," said the latter. "Yes, there is your door, and there is mine," said Jensen. "My room has 3 windows in the daytime," said Anderson, with difficulty suppressing a nervous laugh. "By George, so has mine," said the lawyer, turning and looking at Anderson. His back was now to the door. In that moment the door opened, and an arm came out and clawed at his shoulder. It was clad in ragged, yellowish linen, and the bare skin, where it could be seen, had long grey hair upon it. Anderson was just in time to pull Jensen out of its reach, with a cry of disgust and fright, when the door shut again, and a low laugh was heard. Jensen had seen nothing, but when Anderson hurriedly told him what a risk he had run, he fell into a great state of agitation, and suggested that they should retire from the enterprise and lock themselves up in one or other of their rooms. However, while he was developing this plan, the landlord and 2 able-bodied men arrived on the scene, all looking rather serious and alarmed. Jensen met them with a torrent of description and explanation, which did not at all tend to encourage them for the fray. The men dropped the crowbars they brought, and said flatly that they were not going to risk their throats in that devil's den. The landlord was miserably nervous and undecided, conscious that if the danger were not faced, his hotel was ruined, and very loath to face it himself. Luckily, Anderson hit upon a way of rallying the demoralized force. "Is this," he said, "the Danish courage I have heard so much of? It isn't a German in there, and if it was, we are 5 to 1. The 2 servants and Jensen were stung into action by this, and made a dash at the door. "Stop," said Anderson. "Don't lose your heads. You stay out here with the light, landlord, and one of you 2 men break in the door, and don't go in when it gives way." The men nodded, and the younger stepped forward, raised his crowbar, and dealt a tremendous blow on the upper panel. The result was not in the least what any of them anticipated. There was no cracking or rending of wood, only a dull sound, as if the solid wall had been struck. The man dropped his tool with a shout, and began rubbing his elbow. His cry drew their eyes upon him for a moment. Then Anderson looked at the door again. It was gone. The plaster wall of the passage stared him in the face, with a considerable gash in it where the crowbar had struck it. Number 13 had passed out of existence. For a brief space, they stood perfectly still, gazing at the blank wall. An early cock in the yard beneath was heard to crow, and as Anderson glanced in the direction of the sound, he saw through the window at the end of the long passage that the eastern sky was paling to the dawn. "Perhaps," said the landlord, with hesitation, "you gentlemen would like another room for tonight. A double-bedded one?" Neither Jensen nor Anderson was averse to the suggestion. They felt inclined to hunt in couples, after their late experience. It was found convenient, when each of them went to his room to collect the articles he wanted for the night, that the other should go with him and hold the candle. They noticed that both number 12 and number 14 had 3 windows. Next morning, the same party reassembled in number 12. The landlord was naturally anxious to avoid engaging outside help, and yet it was imperative that the mystery attaching to that part of the house should be cleared up. Accordingly, the 2 servants had been induced to take upon them the function of carpenters. The furniture was cleared away, and, at the cost of a good many irretrievably damaged planks, that portion of the floor was taken up which lay nearest to number 14. You will naturally suppose that a skeleton, say that of Magister Nicholas Franken, was discovered. That was not so. What they did find, lying between the beams which supported the flooring, was a small copper box. In it was a neatly folded vellum document, with about 20 lines of writing. Both Anderson and Jensen, who proved to be something of a paleographer, were much excited by this discovery, which promised to afford the key to these extraordinary phenomena. I possess a copy of an astrological work which I have never read. It has, by way of frontispiece, a woodcut by Hans Sebald Beum, representing a number of sages seated round a table. This detail may enable connoisseurs to identify the book. I cannot myself recollect its title, and it is not at this moment within reach. But the fly-leaves of it are covered with writing, and during the 10 years in which I have owned the volume, I have not been able to determine which way up this writing ought to be read, much less in what language it is. Not dissimilar was the position of Anderson and Jensen after the protracted examination to which they subjected the document in the copper box. After 2 days' contemplation of it, Jensen, who was the bolder spirit of the two, hazarded the conjecture that the language was either Latin or Old Danish. Anderson ventured upon no surmises, and was very willing to surrender the box and the parchment to the Historical Society of Viborg, to be placed in their museum. I had the whole story from him a few months later, as we sat in a wood near Uppsala, after a visit to the library there, where we, or rather I, had laughed over the contract by which Daniel Salthenius, in later life professor of Hebrew at Königsberg, sold himself to Satan. Anderson was not really amused. "Young idiot," he said, meaning Salthenius, who was only an undergraduate when he committed that indiscretion. "How did he know what company he was courting?" And when I suggested the usual considerations, he only grunted. That same afternoon he told me what you have read, but he refused to draw any inferences from it, and to assent to any that I drew for him. The Sealed Room by Arthur Conan Doyle. A solicitor of an active habit and athletic tastes, who is compelled by his hopes of business to remain within the four walls of his office from 10 till 5, must take what exercise he can in the evenings. Hence it was that I was in the habit of indulging in very long nocturnal excursions, in which I sought the heights of Hampstead and Highgate, in order to cleanse my system from the impure air of Abchurch Lane. It was in the course of one of these aimless rambles that I first met Felix Stanniford, and so led up to what has been the most extraordinary adventure of my lifetime. One evening, it was in April or early May of the year 1894, I made my way to the extreme northern fringe of London, and was walking down one of those fine avenues of high brick villas, which the huge city is forever pushing farther and farther out into the country. It was a fine, clear spring night. The moon was shining out of an unclouded sky, and I, having already left many miles behind me, was inclined to walk slowly and look about me. In this contemplative mood, my attention was arrested by one of the houses which I was passing. It was a very large building, standing in its own grounds, a little back from the road. It was modern in appearance, and yet it was far less so than its neighbours, all of which were crudely and painfully new. Their symmetrical line was broken by the gap caused by the laurel-studded lawn, with the great, dark, gloomy house looming at the back of it. Evidently it had been the country retreat of some wealthy merchant, built perhaps when the nearest street was a mile off, and now gradually overtaken, and surrounded by the red brick tentacles of the London octopus. The next stage, I reflected, would be its digestion and absorption, so that the cheap builder might rear a dozen £80-a-year villas upon the garden frontage. And then, as all this passed vaguely through my mind, an incident occurred which brought my thoughts into quite another channel. A four-wheeled cab, that opprobrium of London, was coming jolting and creaking in one direction, while in the other there was a yellow glare from the lamp of a cyclist. They were the only moving objects in the whole long moonlit road, and yet they crashed into each other, with that malignant accuracy which brings two ocean liners together in the broad waste of the Atlantic. It was the cyclist's fault. He tried to cross in front of the cab, miscalculated his distance, and was knocked sprawling by the horse's shoulder. He rose, snarling. The cabman swore back at him, and then, realizing that his number had not yet been taken, lashed his horse and lumbered off. The cyclist caught at the handles of his prostrate machine, and then suddenly sat down with a groan. "Oh, Lord!" he said. I ran across the road to his side. "Any harm done?" I asked. "It's my ankle," said he. "Only a twist, I think, but it's pretty painful. Just give me your hand, will you?" He lay in the yellow circle of the cycle lamp, and I noted, as I helped him to his feet, that he was a gentlemanly young fellow, with a slight dark moustache and large brown eyes, sensitive and nervous in appearance, with indications of weak health upon his sunken cheeks. Work or worry had left its traces upon his thin, yellow face. He stood up when I pulled his hand, but he held one foot in the air, and he groaned as he moved it. "I can't put it to the ground," said he. "Where do you live?" "Here." He nodded his head towards the big dark house in the garden. "I was cutting across to the gate when that confounded cab ran into me. Could you help me so far?" It was easily done. I put his cycle inside the gate, and then I supported him down the drive, and up the steps to the hall door. There was not a light anywhere, and the place was as black and silent as if no one had ever lived in it. "That will do. Thank you very much," said he, fumbling with his key in the lock. "No, you must allow me to see you safe." He made some feeble, petulant protest, and then realized that he could really do nothing without me. The door had opened into a pitch-dark hall. He lurched forward, with my hand still on his arm. "This door to the right," said he, feeling about in the darkness. I opened the door, and at the same moment he managed to strike a light. There was a lamp upon the table, and we lit it between us. "Now, I'm all right. You can leave me now. Goodbye," said he, and with the words he sat down in the armchair and fainted dead away. It was a queer position for me. The fellow looked so ghastly that really I was not sure that he was not dead. Presently his lips quivered and his breast heaved, but his eyes were two white slits, and his colour was horrible. The responsibility was more than I could stand. I pulled at the bell rope, and heard the bell ringing furiously far away. But no one came in response. The bell tinkled away into silence, which no murmur or movement came to break. I waited and rang again, with the same result. There must be someone about. This young gentleman could not live all alone in that huge house. His people ought to know of his condition. If they would not answer the bell, I must hunt them out myself. I seized the lamp and rushed from the room. What I saw outside amazed me. The hall was empty. The stairs were bare and yellow with dust. There were 3 doors opening into spacious rooms, and each was uncarpeted and undraped, save for the grey webs which drooped from the cornice, and rosettes of lichen which had formed upon the walls. My feet reverberated in those empty and silent chambers. Then I wandered on down the passage, with the idea that the kitchens at least might be tenanted. Some caretaker might lurk in some secluded room. No, they were all equally desolate. Despairing of finding any help, I ran down another corridor, and came on something which surprised me more than ever. The passage ended in a large brown door, and the door had a seal of red wax, the size of a 5-shilling piece, over the keyhole. This seal gave me the impression of having been there for a long time, for it was dusty and discoloured. I was still staring at it, and wondering what that door might conceal, when I heard a voice calling behind me, and running back found my young man sitting up in his chair, and very much astonished at finding himself in darkness. "Why on earth did you take the lamp away?" he asked. "I was looking for assistance." "You might look for some time," said he. "I am alone in the house." "Awkward, if you get an illness." "It was foolish of me to faint. I inherit a weak heart from my mother, and pain or emotion has that effect upon me. It will carry me off some day, as it did her. You're not a doctor, are you?" "No, a lawyer. Frank Alder is my name." "Mine is Felix Staniford. Funny that I should meet a lawyer, for my friend, Mr. Percival, was saying that we should need one soon." "Well, very happy, I am sure." "Well, that will depend upon him, you know. Did you say that you had run with that lamp all over the ground floor?" "Yes." "All over it?" he asked, with emphasis, and he looked at me very hard. "I think so. I kept on hoping that I should find someone." "Did you enter all the rooms?" he asked, with the same intent gaze. "Well, all that I could enter." "Oh, then you did notice it," said he, and he shrugged his shoulders with the air of a man who makes the best of a bad job. "Notice what?" "Why, the door with the seal on it." "Yes, I did." "Weren't you curious to know what was in it?" "Well, it did strike me as unusual." "Do you think you could go on living alone in this house, year after year, just longing all the time to know what is at the other side of that door, and yet not looking?" "Do you mean to say," I cried, "that you don't know yourself?" "No more than you do." "Then why don't you look?" "I mustn't," said he. He spoke in a constrained way, and I saw that I had blundered onto some delicate ground. I don't know that I am more inquisitive than my neighbours, but there certainly was something in the situation which appealed very strongly to my curiosity. However, my last excuse for remaining in the house was gone now that my companion had recovered his senses. I rose to go. "Are you in a hurry?" he asked. "No, I have nothing to do." "Well, I should be very glad if you would stay with me a little. The fact is that I live a very retired and secluded life here. I don't suppose there is a man in London who leads such a life as I do. It is quite unusual for me to have anyone to talk with." I looked round at the little room, scantily furnished, with a sofa-bed at one side. Then I thought of the great, bare house and the sinister door with the discoloured red seal upon it. There was something queer and grotesque in the situation, which made me long to know a little more. Perhaps I should, if I waited. I told him that I should be very happy. "You will find the spirits and a siphon upon the side table. You must forgive me if I cannot act as host, but I can't get across the room. Those are cigars in the tray there. I'll take one myself, I think. And so, you are a solicitor, Mr. Alder?" "Yes." "And I am nothing. I am that most helpless of living creatures, the son of a millionaire. I was brought up with the expectation of great wealth, and here I am, a poor man, without any profession at all. And then, on the top of it all, I am left with this great mansion on my hands, which I cannot possibly keep up. Isn't it an absurd situation? For me to use this as my dwelling is like a coster drawing his barrow with a thoroughbred. A donkey would be more useful to him, and a cottage to me." "But why not sell the house?" I asked. "I mustn't." "Let it, then?" "No, I mustn't do that either." I looked puzzled, and my companion smiled. "I'll tell you how it is, if it won't bore you," said he. "Well, on the contrary, I should be exceedingly interested." "I think, after your kind attention to me, I cannot do less than relieve any curiosity that you may feel. You must know that my father was Stanislaus Staniford, the banker." "Staniford, the banker?" I remembered the name at once. His flight from the country, some 7 years before, had been one of the scandals and sensations of the time. "I see that you remember," said my companion. "My poor father left the country to avoid numerous friends, whose savings he had invested in an unsuccessful speculation. He was a nervous, sensitive man, and the responsibility quite upset his reason. He had committed no legal offence. It was purely a matter of sentiment. He would not even face his own family, and he died among strangers, without ever letting us know where he was." "He died?" said I. "We could not prove his death, but we know that it must be so, because the speculations came right again, and so there was no reason why he should not look any man in the face. He would have returned if he were alive, but he must have died in the last 2 years." "Why in the last 2 years?" "Because we heard from him 2 years ago." "Did he not tell you then where he was living?" "The letter came from Paris, but no address was given. It was when my poor mother died. He wrote to me then, with some instructions and some advice, and I have never heard from him since." "Had you heard before?" "Oh, yes, we had heard before, and that's where our mystery of the sealed door, upon which you stumbled tonight, has its origin. Pass me that desk, if you please. Here I have my father's letters, and you are the first man, except Mr. Percival, who has seen them." "Who is Mr. Percival, may I ask?" "He was my father's confidential clerk, and he has continued to be the friend and adviser of my mother, and then of myself. I don't know what we should have done without Percival. He saw the letters, but no one else. This is the first one, which came on the very day when my father fled, 7 years ago. Read it to yourself." This is the letter which I read. "My ever dearest wife, since Sir William told me how weak your heart is, and how harmful any shock might be, I have never talked about my business affairs to you. The time has come when at all risks I can no longer refrain from telling you that things have been going badly with me. This will cause me to leave you for a little time, but it is with the absolute assurance that we shall see each other very soon. On this you can thoroughly rely. Our parting is only for a very short time, my own darling, so don't let it fret you, and above all, don't let it impair your health, for that is what I want above all things to avoid. Now, I have a request to make, and I implore you by all that binds us together to fulfill it exactly as I tell you. There are some things which I do not wish to be seen by anyone in my dark room, the room which I use for photographic purposes at the end of the garden passage. To prevent any painful thoughts, I may assure you once for all, dear, that it is nothing of which I need be ashamed. But still, I do not wish you or Felix to enter that room. It is locked, and I implore you, when you receive this, to at once place a seal over the lock and leave it so. Do not sell or let the house, for in either case my secret will be discovered. As long as you or Felix are in the house, I know that you will comply with my wishes. When Felix is 21, he may enter the room, not before. And now, goodbye, my own best of wives. During our short separation, you can consult Mr. Percival on any matters which may arise. He has my complete confidence. I hate to leave Felix and you, even for a time, but there really is no choice. Ever and always, your loving husband, Stanislaus Staniford. June 4th, 1887. "These are very private family matters for me to inflict upon you," said my companion apologetically. "You must look upon it as done in your professional capacity. I have wanted to speak about it for years." "I am honoured by your confidence," I answered, "and exceedingly interested by the facts. My father was a man who was noted for his almost morbid love of truth. He was always pedantically accurate. When he said, therefore, that he hoped to see my mother very soon, and when he said that he had nothing to be ashamed of in that dark room, you may rely upon it that he meant it." "Well, then what can it be?" I ejaculated. Neither my mother nor I could imagine. We carried out his wishes to the letter, and placed the seal upon the door. There it has been ever since. My mother lived for 5 years after my father's disappearance, although at the time all the doctors said that she could not survive long. Her heart was terribly diseased. During the first few months she had 2 letters from my father. Both had the Paris postmark, but no address. They were short, and to the same effect, that they would soon be reunited, and that she should not fret. Then there was a silence, which lasted until her death, and then came a letter to me, of so private a nature that I cannot show it to you, begging me never to think evil of him, giving me much good advice, and saying that the sealing of the room was of less importance now than during the lifetime of my mother, but that the opening might still cause pain to others, and that, therefore, he thought it best that it should be postponed until my 21st year, for the lapse of time would make things easier. In the meantime, he committed the care of the room to me. So now you can understand how it is that, although I am a very poor man, I can neither let nor sell this great house." "Well, you could mortgage it." "My father had already done so." "It is a most singular state of affairs." "My mother and I were gradually compelled to sell the furniture, and to dismiss the servants, until now, as you see, I am living unattended in a single room. But I have only 2 more months." "What do you mean?" Why, that in 2 months I come of age. The first thing that I do will be to open that door. The second, to get rid of the house. Why should your father have continued to stay away when these investments had recovered themselves? He must be dead. You say that he had not committed any legal offence when he fled the country? None. Why should he not take your mother with him? I do not know. Why should he conceal his address? I do not know. Why should he allow your mother to die and be buried without coming back? I do not know. My dear sir, said I, if I may speak with the frankness of a professional adviser, I should say that it is very clear that your father had the strongest reasons for keeping out of the country, and that, if nothing has been proved against him, he at least thought that something might be, and refused to put himself within the power of the law. Surely that must be obvious, for in what other possible way can the facts be explained? My companion did not take my suggestion in good part. You had not the advantage of knowing my father, Mr. Alder, he said, coldly. I was only a boy when he left us, but I shall always look upon him as my ideal man. His only fault was that he was too sensitive and too unselfish. That anyone should lose money through him would cut him to the heart. His sense of honour was most acute. Any theory of his disappearance which conflicts with that is a mistaken one. It pleased me to hear the lad speak out so roundly, and yet I knew that the facts were against him, and that he was incapable of taking an unprejudiced view of the situation. I only speak as an outsider, said I, and now I must leave you, for I have a long walk before me. Your story has interested me so much that I should be glad if you could let me know the sequel. Leave me your card, said he, and so, having bade him good night, I left him. I heard nothing more of the matter for some time, and had almost feared that it would prove to be one of those fleeting experiences which drift away from our direct observation, and end only in a hope or a suspicion. One afternoon, however, a card bearing the name of Mr. J. H. Percival was brought up to my office in Abchurch Lane, and its bearer, a small, dry, bright-eyed fellow of 50, was ushered in by the clerk. "I believe, sir," said he, "that my name has been mentioned to you by my young friend, Mr. Felix Staniford." "Of course," I answered. "I remember." "He spoke to you, I understand, about the circumstances in connection with the disappearance of my former employer, Mr. Stanislaus Staniford, and the existence of a sealed room in his former residence." "He did." "And you expressed an interest in the matter." "Well, it interested me extremely." "You are aware that we hold Mr. Staniford's permission to open the door on the 21st birthday of his son?" "I remember." "The 21st birthday is today." "Have you opened it?" I asked eagerly. "Not yet, sir," said he gravely. "I have reason to believe that it would be well to have witnesses present when that door is opened. You are a lawyer, and you are acquainted with the facts. Will you be present on the occasion?" "Most certainly." "You are employed during the day, and so am I. Shall we meet at 9 o'clock at the house?" "I will come with pleasure." "Then you will find us waiting for you. Good-bye for the present." He bowed solemnly, and took his leave. I kept my appointment that evening with a brain which was weary with fruitless attempts to think out some plausible explanation of the mystery which we were about to solve. Mr. Percival and my young acquaintance were waiting for me in the little room. I was not surprised to see the young man looking pale and nervous, but I was rather astonished to find the dry little city man in a state of intense, though partially suppressed, excitement. His cheeks were flushed, his hands twitching, and he could not stand still for an instant. Staniford greeted me warmly, and thanked me many times for having come. "And now, Percival," said he to his companion, "I suppose there is no obstacle to our putting the thing through without delay. I shall be glad to get it over." The banker's clerk took up the lamp and led the way, but he paused in the passage outside the door, and his hand was shaking, so that the light flickered up and down the high, bare walls. "Mr. Staniford," said he, in a cracking voice, "I hope you will prepare yourself in case any shock should be awaiting you when that seal is removed and the door is opened." "What could there be, Percival? You are trying to frighten me." "No, Mr. Staniford, but I should wish you to be ready, to be braced up, not to allow yourself—" He had to lick his dry lips between every jerky sentence, and I suddenly realized, as clearly as if he had told me, that he knew what was behind that closed door, and that it was something terrible. "Here are the keys, Mr. Staniford, but remember my warning." He had a bunch of assorted keys in his hand, and the young man snatched them from him. Then he thrust a knife under the discoloured seal and jerked it off. The lamp was rattling and shaking in Percival's hands, so I took it from him and held it near the keyhole, while Staniford tried key after key. At last one turned in the lock. The door flew open. He took one step into the room, and then, with a horrible cry, the young man fell senseless at our feet. If I had not given heed to the clerk's warning and braced myself for a shock, I should certainly have dropped the lamp. The room, windowless and bare, was fitted up as a photographic laboratory, with a tap and sink at the side of it. A shelf of bottles and measures stood at one side, and a peculiar, heavy smell, partly chemical, partly animal, filled the air. A single table and chair were in front of us, and at this, with his back turned towards us, a man was seated in the act of writing. His outline and attitude were as natural as life, but as the light fell upon him, it made my hair rise to see that the nape of his neck was black and wrinkled, and no thicker than my wrist. Dust lay upon him, thick yellow dust, upon his hair, his shoulders, his shrivelled, lemon-coloured hands. His head had fallen forward upon his breast. His pen still rested upon a discoloured sheet of paper. "My poor master! My poor, poor master!" cried the clerk, and the tears were running down his cheeks. "What?" I cried. "Mr. Stanislaus Staniford?" "Here he has sat for 7 years. Oh, why would he do it? I begged him, I implored him, I went on my knees to him, but he would have his way. You see the key on the table. He had locked the door upon the inside, and he has written something. We must take it." Yes, take it, and for God's sake let us get out of this," I cried. "The air is poisonous. Come, Staniford, come." Taking an arm each, we half led and half carried the terrified man back to his own room. "It was my father," he cried, as he recovered his consciousness. "He is sitting there, dead, in his chair. You knew it, Percival. This was what you meant when you warned me." "Yes, I knew it, Mr. Staniford. I have acted for the best all along, but my position has been a terribly difficult one. For 7 years I have known that your father was dead in that room." "You knew it, and never told us." "Don't be harsh with me, Mr. Staniford, sir. Make allowance for a man who has had a hard part to play." "My head is swimming round. I cannot grasp it." He staggered up and helped himself from the brandy bottle. These letters to my mother and to myself, were they forgeries?" "No, sir. Your father wrote them, and addressed them, and left them in my keeping to be posted. I have followed his instructions to the very letter in all things. He was my master, and I have obeyed him." The brandy had steadied the young man's shaken nerves. "Tell me about it. I can stand it now," said he. "Well, Mr. Staniford, you know that at one time there came a period of great trouble upon your father, and he thought that many poor people were about to lose their savings through his fault. He was a man who was so tender-hearted that he could not bear the thought. It worried him and tormented him until he determined to end his life. Oh, Mr. Staniford, if you knew how I have prayed him and wrestled with him over it, you would never blame me. And he in turn prayed me, as no man has ever prayed me before. He had made up his mind, and he would do it in any case, he said. But it rested with me whether his death should be happy and easy, or whether it should be most miserable. I read in his eyes that he meant what he said, and at last I yielded to his prayers, and I consented to do his will. What was troubling him was this. He had been told by the first doctor in London that his wife's heart would fail at the slightest shock. He had a horror of accelerating her end, and yet his own existence had become unendurable to him. How could he end himself without injuring her? You know now the course that he took. He wrote the letter which she received. There was nothing in it which was not literally true. When he spoke of seeing her again so soon, he was referring to her own approaching death, which he had been assured could not be delayed by more than a very few months. So convinced was he of this, that he only left 2 letters to be forwarded at intervals after his death. She lived 5 years, and I had no letters to send. He left another letter with me, to be sent to you, sir, upon the occasion of the death of your mother. I posted all these in Paris, to sustain the idea of his being abroad. It was his wish that I should say nothing, and I have said nothing. I have been a faithful servant. 7 years after his death, he thought no doubt that the shock to the feelings of his surviving friends would be lessened. He was always considerate for others." There was a silence for some time. It was broken by young Staniford. "I cannot blame you, Percival. You have spared my mother a shock, which would certainly have broken her heart. What is that paper?" "It is what your father was writing, sir. Shall I read it to you?" "Do so." "I have taken the poison, and I feel it working in my veins. It is strange, but not painful. When these words are read, I shall, if my wishes have been faithfully carried out, have been dead many years. Surely no one who has lost money through me will still bear me animosity. And you, Felix, you will forgive me this family scandal. May God find rest for a sorely wearied spirit." "Amen," we cried, all 3. The Room in the Tower by E.F. Benson. It is probable that everybody who is at all a constant dreamer has had at least one experience of an event, or a sequence of circumstances which have come to his mind in sleep, being subsequently realized in the material world. But, in my opinion, so far from this being a strange thing, it would be far odder if this fulfilment did not occasionally happen. since our dreams are, as a rule, concerned with people whom we know, and places with which we are familiar, such as might very naturally occur in the awake and daylit world. True, these dreams are often broken into by some absurd and fantastic incident, which puts them out of court in regard to their subsequent fulfilment. But, on the mere calculation of chances, it does not appear in the least unlikely that a dream, imagined by anyone who dreams constantly, should occasionally come true. Not long ago, for instance, I experienced such a fulfilment of a dream, which seems to me in no way remarkable, and to have no kind of psychical significance. The manner of it was as follows. A certain friend of mine, living abroad, is amiable enough to write to me about once in a fortnight. Thus, when 14 days or thereabouts have elapsed since I last heard from him, my mind, probably either consciously or subconsciously, is expectant of a letter from him. One night last week, I dreamed that as I was going upstairs to dress for dinner, I heard, as I often heard, the sound of the postman's knock on my front door, and diverted my direction downstairs instead. There, among other correspondence, was a letter from him. Thereafter the fantastic entered, for on opening it I found inside the ace of diamonds, and scribbled across it, in his well-known handwriting, "I am sending you this for safe custody, as you know it is running an unreasonable risk to keep aces in Italy." The next evening I was just preparing to go upstairs to dress when I heard the postman's knock, and did precisely as I had done in my dream. There, among other letters, was one from my friend. Only it did not contain the ace of diamonds. Had it done so, I should have attached more weight to the matter, which, as it stands, seems to me a perfectly ordinary coincidence. No doubt I consciously, or subconsciously, expected a letter from him, and this suggested to me my dream. Similarly, the fact that my friend had not written to me for a fortnight suggested to him that he should do so. But occasionally it is not so easy to find such an explanation, and for the following story I can find no explanation at all. It came out of the dark, and into the dark it has gone again. All my life I have been a habitual dreamer. The nights are few, that is to say, when I do not find on awaking in the morning that some mental experience has been mine, and sometimes, all night long apparently, a series of the most dazzling adventures befall me. Almost without exception, these adventures are pleasant, though often merely trivial. It is of an exception that I am going to speak. It was when I was about 16 that a certain dream first came to me, and this is how it befell. It opened with my being set down at the door of a big red brick house, where, I understood, I was going to stay. The servant who opened the door told me that tea was being served in the garden, and led me through a low, dark-panelled hall, with a large open fireplace, onto a cheerful green lawn, set round with flower-beds. There were grouped about the tea-table a small party of people, but they were all strangers to me, except one, who was a schoolfellow called Jack Stone, clearly the son of the house, and he introduced me to his mother and father and a couple of sisters. I was, I remember, somewhat astonished to find myself here, for the boy in question was scarcely known to me, and I rather disliked what I knew of him. Moreover, he had left school nearly a year before. The afternoon was very hot, and an intolerable oppression reigned. On the far side of the lawn ran a red brick wall with an iron gate in its centre, outside which stood a walnut tree. We sat in the shadow of the house opposite a row of long windows, inside which I could see a table with cloth laid, glimmering with glass and silver. This garden front of the house was very long, and at one end of it stood a tower of 3 stories, which looked to me much older than the rest of the building. Before long, Mrs. Stone, who, like the rest of the party, had sat in absolute silence, said to me, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." Quite inexplicably, my heart sank at her words. I felt as if I had known that I should have the room in the tower, and that it contained something dreadful and significant. Jack instantly got up, and I understood that I had to follow him. In silence we passed through the hall, and mounted a great oak staircase with many corners, and arrived at a small landing with 2 doors set in it. He pushed one of these open for me to enter, and without coming in himself, closed it after me. Then I knew that my conjecture had been right. There was something awful in the room, and with the terror of nightmare growing swiftly and enveloping me, I awoke in a spasm of terror. Now, that dream, or variations on it, occurred to me intermittently for 15 years. Most often it came in exactly this form: the arrival, the tea laid out on the lawn, the deadly silence, succeeded by that one deadly sentence, the mounting with Jack Stone up to the room in the tower, where horror dwelt, and it always came to a close in the nightmare of terror at that which was in the room, though I never saw what it was. At other times I experienced variations on this same theme. Occasionally, for instance, we would be sitting at dinner in the dining-room, into the windows of which I had looked on the first night when the dream of this house visited me. But wherever we were, there was the same silence, the same sense of dreadful oppression and foreboding. And the silence, I knew, would always be broken by Mrs. Stone saying to me, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." Upon which, this was invariable, I had to follow him up the oak staircase with many corners, and enter the place that I dreaded more and more each time that I visited it in sleep. Or, again, I would find myself playing cards, still in silence, in a drawing-room lit with immense chandeliers that gave a blinding illumination. What the game was, I have no idea. What I remember, with a sense of miserable anticipation, was that soon Mrs. Stone would get up and say to me, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." This drawing-room where we played cards was next to the dining-room, and, as I have said, was always brilliantly illuminated, whereas the rest of the house was full of dusk and shadows. And yet how often, in spite of those bouquets of lights, have I not pored over the cards that were dealt me, scarcely able for some reason to see them. Their designs, too, were strange. There were no red suits, but all were black, and among them there were certain cards which were black all over. I hated and dreaded those. As this dream continued to recur, I got to know the greater part of the house. There was a smoking-room beyond the drawing-room, at the end of a passage with a green baize door. It was always very dark there, and as often as I went there, I passed somebody whom I could not see, in the doorway coming out. Curious developments, too, took place in the characters that peopled the dream, as might happen to living persons. Mrs. Stone, for instance, who, when I first saw her, had been black-haired, became grey, and instead of rising briskly, as she had done at first, when she said, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower," got up very feebly, as if the strength was leaving her limbs. Jack also grew up, and became a rather ill-looking young man, with a brown moustache, while one of the sisters ceased to appear, and I understood she was married. Then it so happened that I was not visited by this dream for 6 months or more, and I began to hope, in such inexplicable dread did I hold it, that it had passed away for good. But one night, after this interval, I again found myself being shown out onto the lawn for tea, and Mrs. Stone was not there, while the others were all dressed in black. At once I guessed the reason, and my heart leaped at the thought that perhaps this time I should not have to sleep in the room in the tower. And though we usually all sat in silence, on this occasion the sense of relief made me talk and laugh, as I had never yet done. But even then, matters were not altogether comfortable, for no one else spoke, but they all looked secretly at each other. And soon the foolish stream of my talk ran dry, and gradually an apprehension, worse than anything I had previously known, gained on me, as the light slowly faded. Suddenly, a voice which I knew well broke the stillness, the voice of Mrs. Stone, saying, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." It seemed to come from near the gate in the red brick wall that bounded the lawn, and looking up, I saw that the grass outside was sown thick with gravestones. A curious greyish light shone from them, and I could read the lettering on the grave nearest me, and it was, "In evil memory of Julia Stone." And, as usual, Jack got up, and again I followed him through the hall, and up the staircase with many corners. On this occasion it was darker than usual, and when I passed into the room in the tower, I could only just see the furniture, the position of which was already familiar to me. Also, there was a dreadful odour of decay in the room, and I woke, screaming. This dream, with such variations and developments as I have mentioned, went on at intervals for 15 years. Sometimes I would dream it 2 or 3 nights in succession. Once, as I have said, there was an intermission of 6 months. But taking a reasonable average, I should say that I dreamed it quite as often as once in a month. It had, as is plain, something of nightmare about it, since it always ended in the same appalling terror, which, so far from getting less, seemed to me to gather fresh fear every time that I experienced it. There was, too, a strange and dreadful consistency about it. The characters in it, as I have mentioned, got regularly older. Death and marriage visited this silent family, and I never, in the dream, after Mrs. Stone had died, set eyes on her again. But it was always her voice that told me that the room in the tower was prepared for me, and whether we had tea out on the lawn, or the scene was laid in one of the rooms overlooking it, I could always see her gravestone, standing just outside the iron gate. It was the same, too, with the married daughter. Usually she was not present, but once or twice she returned again, in company with a man whom I took to be her husband. He, too, like the rest of them, was always silent. But, owing to the constant repetition of the dream, I had ceased to attach, in my waking hours, any significance to it. I never met Jack Stone again during all those years, nor did I ever see a house that resembled this dark house of my dream. And then something happened. I had been in London in this year, up till the end of the July, and during the first week in August went down to stay with a friend in a house he had taken for the summer months in the Ashdown Forest district of Sussex. I left London early, for John Clinton was to meet me at Forest Row Station, and we were going to spend the day golfing, and go to his house in the evening. He had his motor with him, and we set off about 5 in the afternoon, after a thoroughly delightful day, for the drive, the distance being some 10 miles. As it was still so early, we did not have tea at the clubhouse, but waited till we should get home. As we drove, the weather, which up till then had been, though hot, deliciously fresh, seemed to me to alter in quality, and become very stagnant and oppressive, and I felt that indefinable sense of ominous apprehension that I am accustomed to before thunder. John, however, did not share my views, attributing my loss of lightness to the fact that I had lost both my matches. Events proved, however, that I was right, though I do not think that the thunderstorm that broke that night was the sole cause of my depression. Our way lay through deep, high-banked lanes, and before we had gone very far I fell asleep, and was only awakened by the stopping of the motor. And with a sudden thrill, partly of fear, but chiefly of curiosity, I found myself standing in the doorway of my house of dream. We went, I half wondering whether or not I was dreaming still, through a low, oak-panelled hall, and out onto the lawn, where tea was laid in the shadow of the house. It was set in flower beds, a red brick wall with a gate in it, bounded one side, and out beyond that was a space of rough grass and a walnut tree. The facade of the house was very long, and at one end stood a 3-storied tower, markedly older than the rest. Here, for the moment, all resemblance to the repeated dream ceased. There was no silent and somehow terrible family, but a large assembly of exceedingly cheerful persons, all of whom were known to me, and in spite of the horror with which the dream itself had always filled me, I felt nothing of it, now that the scene of it was thus reproduced before me. But I felt intensest curiosity as to what was going to happen. Tea pursued its cheerful course, and before long Mrs. Clinton got up. And at that moment I think I knew what she was going to say. She spoke to me, and what she said was, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." At that, for half a second, the horror of the dream took hold of me again. But it quickly passed, and again I felt nothing more than the most intense curiosity. It was not very long before it was amply satisfied. John turned to me. "Right up at the top of the house," he said. "But I think you'll be comfortable. We're absolutely full up. Would you like to go and see it now? By Jove, I believe that you are right, and that we are going to have a thunderstorm. How dark it has become." I got up and followed him. We passed through the hall, and up the perfectly familiar staircase. Then he opened the door, and I went in. And at that moment, sheer, unreasoning terror again possessed me. I did not know what I feared. I simply feared. Then, like a sudden recollection, when one remembers a name which has long escaped the memory, I knew what I feared. I feared Mrs. Stone, whose grave, with the sinister inscription, "In evil memory," I had so often seen in my dream, just beyond the lawn which lay below my window. And then, once more, the fear passed so completely that I wondered what there was to fear, and I found myself, sober and quiet and sane, in the room in the tower, the name of which I had so often heard in my dream, and the scene of which was so familiar. I looked around it with a certain sense of proprietorship, and found that nothing had been changed from the dreaming nights in which I knew it so well. Just to the left of the door was the bed, lengthways along the wall, with the head of it in the angle. In a line with it was the fireplace and a small bookcase. Opposite the door, the outer wall was pierced by 2 lattice-paned windows, between which stood the dressing-table, while ranged along the 4th wall was the washing-stand and a big cupboard. My luggage had already been unpacked, for the furniture of dressing and undressing lay orderly on the washstand and toilet-table, while my dinner clothes were spread out on the coverlet of the bed. And then, with a sudden start of unexplained dismay, I saw that there were 2 rather conspicuous objects which I had not seen before in my dreams. One, a life-sized oil painting of Mrs. Stone, the other, a black-and-white sketch of Jack Stone, representing him as he had appeared to me only a week before, in the last of the series of these repeated dreams, a rather secret and evil-looking man of about 30. His picture hung between the windows, looking straight across the room to the other portrait, which hung at the side of the bed. At that I looked next, and as I looked, I felt once more the horror of nightmare seize me. It represented Mrs. Stone as I had seen her last in my dreams, old and withered and white-haired. But in spite of the evident feebleness of body, a dreadful exuberance and vitality shone through the envelope of flesh, an exuberance wholly malign, a vitality that foamed and frothed with unimaginable evil. Evil beamed from the narrow, leering eyes. It laughed in the demon-like mouth. The whole face was instinct with some secret and appalling mirth. The hands, clasped together on the knee, seemed shaking with suppressed and nameless glee. Then I saw also that it was signed in the left-hand bottom corner, and wondering who the artist could be, I looked more closely and read the inscription, Julia Stone, by Julia Stone. There came a tap at the door, and John Clinton entered. "Got everything you want?" he asked. "Rather more than I want," said I, pointing to the picture. He laughed. "Hard-featured old lady," he said. "By herself, too, I remember. Anyhow, she can't have flattered herself much." "But don't you see?" said I. "It's scarcely a human face at all. It's the face of some witch, of some devil." He looked at it more closely. "Yes, it isn't very pleasant," he said. "Scarcely a bedside manner, eh? Yes, I can imagine getting the nightmare if I went to sleep with that close by my bed. I'll have it taken down if you like." "I really wish you would," I said. He rang the bell, and with the help of a servant, we detached the picture and carried it out onto the landing, and put it with its face to the wall. "By Jove, the old lady is a weight," said John, mopping his forehead. "I wonder if she had something on her mind." The extraordinary weight of the picture had struck me too. I was about to reply, when I caught sight of my own hand. There was blood on it, in considerable quantities, covering the whole palm. "I've cut myself somehow," said I. John gave a little startled exclamation. "Why, I have too," he said. Simultaneously, the footman took out his handkerchief and wiped his hand with it. I saw that there was blood also on his handkerchief. John and I went back into the tower room and washed the blood off, but neither on his hand nor on mine was there the slightest trace of a scratch or cut. It seemed to me that, having ascertained this, we both, by a sort of tacit consent, did not allude to it again, Something in my case had dimly occurred to me that I did not wish to think about. It was but a conjecture, but I fancied that I knew the same thing had occurred to him. The heat and oppression of the air, for the storm we had expected was still undischarged, increased very much after dinner, and for some time most of the party, among whom were John Clinton and myself, sat outside on the path bounding the lawn where we had had tea. The night was absolutely dark, and no twinkle of star or moon ray could penetrate the pall of cloud that overset the sky. By degrees our assembly thinned. The women went up to bed, men dispersed to the smoking or billiard room, and by 11 o'clock my host and I were the only two left. All the evening I thought that he had had something on his mind, and as soon as we were alone, he spoke. "The man who helped us with the picture had blood on his hand too. Did you notice?" he said. "I asked him just now if he had cut himself, and he said he supposed he had, but that he could find no mark of it. Now, where did that blood come from?" By dint of telling myself that I was not going to think about it, I had succeeded in not doing so, and I did not want, especially just at bedtime, to be reminded of it. "I don't know," said I, "and I don't really care, so long as the picture of Mrs. Stone is not by my bed." He got up. "But it's odd," he said. "Ha! Now you'll see another odd thing." A dog of his, an Irish terrier by breed, had come out of the house as we talked. The door behind us into the hall was open, and a bright oblong of light shone across the lawn to the iron gate which led on to the rough grass outside, where the walnut tree stood. I saw that the dog had all his hackles up, bristling with rage and fright. His lips were curled back from his teeth, as if he was ready to spring at something, and he was growling to himself. He took not the slightest notice of his master or me, but stiffly and tensely walked across the grass to the iron gate. There he stood for a moment, looking through the bars, and still growling. Then, of a sudden, his courage seemed to desert him. He gave one long howl, and scuttled back to the house with a curious, crouching sort of movement. "He does that half a dozen times a day," said John. "He sees something which he both hates and fears." I walked to the gate and looked over it. Something was moving on the grass outside, and soon a sound, which I could not instantly identify, came to my ears. Then I remembered what it was. It was the purring of a cat. I lit a match and saw the purrer, a big blue Persian, walking round and round in a little circle just outside the gate, stepping high and ecstatically, with tail carried aloft like a banner. Its eyes were bright and shining, and every now and then it put its head down and sniffed at the grass. I laughed. "The end of that mystery, I'm afraid," I said. "Here's a large cat having Walpurgis night all alone." "Yes, that's Darius," said John. "He spends half the day and all night there. But that's not the end of the dog mystery, for Toby and he are the best of friends, but the beginning of the cat mystery. What's the cat doing there? And why is Darius pleased while Toby is terror-stricken?" At that moment I remembered the rather horrible detail of my dreams, when I saw through the gate, just where the cat was now, the white tombstone with the sinister inscription. But before I could answer, the rain began, as suddenly and heavily as if a tap had been turned on, and simultaneously the big cat squeezed through the bars of the gate and came leaping across the lawn to the house for shelter. Then it sat in the doorway, looking out eagerly into the dark. It spat and struck at John with its paw as he pushed it in order to close the door. Somehow, with the portrait of Julia Stone in the passage outside, the room in the tower had absolutely no alarm for me, and as I went to bed, feeling very sleepy and heavy, I had nothing more than interest for the curious incident about our bleeding hands and the conduct of the cat and dog. The last thing I looked at before I put out my light was the square, empty space by my bed where the portrait had been. Here the paper was of its original full tint of dark red. Over the rest of the walls it had faded. Then I blew out my candle and instantly fell asleep. My awaking was equally instantaneous, and I sat bolt upright in bed, under the impression that some bright light had been flashed in my face, though it was now absolutely pitch dark. I knew exactly where I was, in the room which I had dreaded in dreams, but no horror that I ever felt when asleep approached the fear that now invaded and froze my brain. Immediately after, a peal of thunder crackled just above the house, but the probability that it was only a flash of lightning which awoke me gave no reassurance to my galloping heart. Something, I knew, was in the room with me, and instinctively I put out my right hand, which was nearest the wall, to keep it away, and my hand touched the edge of a picture frame, hanging close to me. I sprang out of bed, upsetting the small table that stood by it, and I heard my watch, candle, and matches clatter onto the floor. But for the moment there was no need of light, for a blinding flash leaped out of the clouds, and showed me that by my bed again hung the picture of Mrs. Stone. And instantly the room went into blackness again. But in that flash I saw another thing also, namely a figure that leaned over the end of my bed, watching me. It was dressed in some close-clinging white garment, spotted and stained with mould, and the face was that of the portrait. Overhead the thunder cracked and roared, and when it ceased, and the deathly stillness succeeded, I heard the rustle of movement coming nearer me, and, more horrible yet, perceived an odour of corruption and decay. And then a hand was laid on the side of my neck, and close beside my ear I heard quick-taken, eager breathing. Yet I knew that this thing, though it could be perceived by touch, by smell, by eye, and by ear, was still not of this earth, but something that had passed out of the body and had power to make itself manifest. Then a voice, already familiar to me, spoke. "I knew you would come to the room in the tower," it said. "I have been long waiting for you. At last you have come. Tonight I shall feast. Before long we will feast together." And the quick breathing came closer to me. I could feel it on my neck. At that, the terror, which I think had paralyzed me for the moment, gave way to the wild instinct of self-preservation. I hit wildly with both arms, kicking out at the same moment, and heard a little animal squeal, and something soft dropped with a thud beside me. I took a couple of steps forward, nearly tripping up over whatever it was that lay there, and by the merest good luck found the handle of the door. In another second I ran out on the landing, and had banged the door behind me. Almost at the same moment I heard a door open somewhere below, and John Clinton, candle in hand, came running upstairs. "What is it?" he said. "I sleep just below you, and heard a noise as if— Good heavens! There's blood on your shoulder!" I stood there, so he told me afterwards, swaying from side to side, white as a sheet, with the mark on my shoulder, as if a hand covered with blood had been laid there. "It's in there," I said, pointing. "She, you know. The portrait is in there too, hanging up on the place we took it from." At that he laughed. "My dear fellow, this is mere nightmare," he said. He pushed by me and opened the door, I standing there, simply inert with terror, unable to stop him, unable to move. "Phew, what an awful smell," he said. Then there was silence. He had passed out of my sight behind the open door. Next moment he came out again, as white as myself, and instantly shut it. "Yes, the portrait's there," he said, "and on the floor is a thing spotted with earth, like what they bury people in. Come away, quick, come away." How I got downstairs I hardly know. An awful shuddering and nausea of the spirit rather than of the flesh had seized me, and more than once he had to place my feet upon the steps, while every now and then he cast glances of terror and apprehension up the stairs. But in time we came to his dressing-room on the floor below, and there I told him what I have here described. The sequel can be made short. Indeed, some of my readers have perhaps already guessed what it was, if they remember that inexplicable affair of the churchyard at West Fawley, some 8 years ago, where an attempt was made 3 times to bury the body of a certain woman who had committed suicide. On each occasion, the coffin was found, in the course of a few days, again protruding from the ground. After the 3rd attempt, in order that the thing should not be talked about, the body was buried elsewhere, in unconsecrated ground. Where it was buried was just outside the iron gate of the garden belonging to the house where this woman had lived. She had committed suicide in a room at the top of the tower in that house. Her name was Julia Stone. Subsequently, the body was again secretly dug up, and the coffin was found to be full of blood. The Red Room by H.G. Wells. "I can assure you," said I, "that it will take a very tangible ghost to frighten me." And I stood up before the fire with my glass in my hand. "It is your own choosing," said the man with the withered arm, and glanced at me askance. 28 years, said I, have I lived, and never a ghost have I seen as yet. The old woman sat staring hard into the fire, her pale eyes wide open. "Aye," she broke in, "and 28 years you have lived, and never seen the likes of this house, I reckon. There's a many things to see when one's still but 28. She swayed her head slowly from side to side. many things to see, and sorrow for." I half suspected the old people were trying to enhance the spiritual terrors of their house by their droning insistence. I put down my empty glass on the table and looked about the room, and caught a glimpse of myself, abbreviated and broadened to an impossible sturdiness in the queer old mirror at the end of the room. "Well," I said, "if I see anything tonight, I shall be so much the wiser, for I come to the business with an open mind." "It's your own choosing," said the man with the withered arm once more. I heard the faint sound of a stick and a shambling step on the flags in the passage outside. The door creaked on its hinges as a second old man entered, more bent, more wrinkled, more aged even than the first. He supported himself by the help of a crutch. His eyes were covered by a shade, and his lower lip, half averted, hung pale and pink from his decaying yellow teeth. He made straight for an armchair on the opposite side of the table, sat down clumsily, and began to cough. The man with the withered hand gave the newcomer a short glance of positive dislike. The old woman took no notice of his arrival, but remained with her eyes fixed steadily on the fire. "I said, it's your own choosing," said the man with the withered hand, when the coughing had ceased for a while. "It's my own choosing," I answered. The man with the shade became aware of my presence for the first time, and threw his head back for a moment and sidewise to see me. I caught a momentary glimpse of his eyes, small and bright and inflamed. Then he began to cough and splutter again. "Why don't you drink?" said the man with the withered arm, pushing the beer toward him. The man with the shade poured out a glassful with a shaking hand that splashed half as much again on the deal table. A monstrous shadow of him crouched upon the wall and mocked his action as he poured and drank. I must confess, I had scarcely expected these grotesque custodians. There is, to my mind, something inhuman in senility, something crouching and atavistic. The human qualities seem to drop from old people insensibly day by day. The three of them made me feel uncomfortable with their gaunt silences, their bent carriage, their evident unfriendliness to me and to one another. And that night, perhaps, I was in the mood for uncomfortable impressions. I resolved to get away from their vague foreshadowings of the evil things upstairs. "If," said I, "you will show me to this haunted room of yours, I will make myself comfortable there." The old man with the cough jerked his head back so suddenly that it startled me, and shot another glance of his red eyes at me from out of the darkness under the shade. But no one answered me. I waited a minute, glancing from one to the other. The old woman stared like a dead body, glaring into the fire with lacklustre eyes. "If," I said, a little louder, "if you will show me to this haunted room of yours, I will relieve you from the task of entertaining me." "There's a candle on the slab outside the door," said the man with the withered hand, looking at my feet as he addressed me. "But if you go to the Red Room tonight—" "This night of all nights," said the old woman softly. "You go alone." "Very well," I answered shortly. "And which way do I go?" "You go along the passage for a bit," said he, nodding his head on his shoulder at the door, "until you come to a spiral staircase, and on the second landing is a door covered with green baize. Go through that, and down the long corridor to the end, and the Red Room is on your left, up the steps." "Have I got that right?" I said, and repeated his directions. He corrected me in one particular. "And you are really going?" said the man with the shade, looking at me again for the third time with that queer, unnatural tilting of the face. "This night of all nights," whispered the old woman. "It is what I came for," I said, and moved toward the door. As I did so, the old man with the shade rose and staggered round the table so as to be closer to the others and to the fire. At the door I turned and looked at them, and saw they were all close together, dark against the firelight, staring at me over their shoulders, with an intent expression on their ancient faces. "Good night," I said, setting the door open. "It's your own choosing," said the man with the withered arm. I left the door wide open until the candle was well alight, and then I shut them in, and walked down the chilly, echoing passage. I must confess that the oddness of these 3 old pensioners, in whose charge her ladyship had left the castle, and the deep-toned, old-fashioned furniture of the housekeeper's room, in which they foregathered, had affected me curiously, in spite of my effort to keep myself at a matter-of-fact phase. They seemed to belong to another age, an older age, an age when things spiritual were indeed to be feared, when common sense was uncommon, an age when omens and witches were credible, and ghosts beyond denying. Their very existence, thought I, is spectral. The cut of their clothing, fashions born in dead brains. The ornaments and conveniences in the rooms about them, even, are ghostly. The thoughts of vanished men, which still haunt rather than participate in the world of today. And the passage I was in, long and shadowy, with a film of moisture glistening on the wall, was as gaunt and cold as a thing that is dead and rigid. But, with an effort, I sent such thoughts to the right about. The long, draughty, subterranean passage was chilly and dusty, and my candle flared, and made the shadows cower and quiver. The echoes rang up and down the spiral staircase, and a shadow came sweeping up after me, and another fled before me into the darkness overhead. I came to the wide landing, and stopped there for a moment, listening to a rustling that I fancied I heard creeping behind me, and then, satisfied of the absolute silence, pushed open the unwilling baize-covered door, and stood in the silent corridor. The effect was scarcely what I expected, for the moonlight, coming in by the great window on the grand staircase, picked out everything in vivid black shadow or reticulated silvery illumination. Everything seemed in its proper position. The house might have been deserted on the yesterday instead of 12 months ago. There were candles in the sockets of the sconces, and whatever dust had gathered on the carpets or upon the polished flooring was distributed so evenly as to be invisible in my candle light. A waiting stillness was over everything. I was about to advance, and stopped abruptly. A bronze group stood upon the landing, hidden from me by a corner of the wall, but its shadow fell with marvellous distinctness upon the white panelling, and gave me the impression of someone crouching to waylay me. The thing jumped upon my attention suddenly. I stood rigid for half a moment, perhaps. Then, with my hand in the pocket that held a revolver, I advanced, only to discover a Ganymede and eagle glistening in the moonlight. That incident for a time restored my nerve, and a dim porcelain Chinaman on a buhl table, whose head rocked as I passed, scarcely startled me. The door of the Red Room and the steps up to it were in a shadowy corner. I moved my candle from side to side, in order to see clearly the nature of the recess in which I stood, before opening the door. Here it was, thought I, that my predecessor was found, and the memory of that story gave me a sudden twinge of apprehension. I glanced over my shoulder at the black Ganymede in the moonlight, and opened the door of the Red Room rather hastily, with my face half turned to the pallid silence of the corridor. I entered, closed the door behind me at once, turned the key I found in the lock within, and stood, with the candle held aloft, surveying the scene of my vigil, the great red room of Lorraine Castle, in which the young Duke had died, or rather in which he had begun his dying, for he had opened the door and fallen headlong down the steps I had just ascended. That had been the end of his vigil, of his gallant attempt to conquer the ghostly tradition of the place, and never, I thought, had apoplexy better served the ends of superstition. There were other and older stories that clung to the room, back to the half-incredible beginning of it all, the tale of a timid wife, and the tragic end that came to her husband's jest of frightening her. And looking round that huge, shadowy room, with its black window bays, its recesses and alcoves, its dusty brown-red hangings, and dark, gigantic furniture, one could well understand the legends that had sprouted in its black corners, its germinating darknesses. My candle was a little tongue of light in the vastness of the chamber. Its rays failed to pierce to the opposite end of the room, and left an ocean of dull red mystery and suggestion, sentinel shadows and watching darknesses beyond its island of light. And the stillness of desolation brooded over it all. I must confess, some impalpable quality of that ancient room disturbed me. I tried to fight the feeling down. I resolved to make a systematic examination of the place, and so, by leaving nothing to the imagination, dispel the fanciful suggestions of the obscurity before they obtained a hold upon me. After satisfying myself of the fastening of the door, I began to walk round the room, peering round each article of furniture, tucking up the valances of the bed, and opening its curtains wide. In one place there was a distinct echo to my footsteps. The noises I made seemed so little that they enhanced rather than broke the silence of the place. I pulled up the blinds and examined the fastenings of the several windows. Attracted by the fall of a particle of dust, I leaned forward and looked up the blackness of the wide chimney. Then, trying to preserve my scientific attitude of mind, I walked round and began tapping the oak panelling for any secret opening, but I desisted before reaching the alcove. I saw my face in a mirror, white. There were 2 big mirrors in the room, each with a pair of sconces bearing candles, and on the mantel-shelf, too, were candles in china candlesticks. All these I lit, one after the other. The fire was laid, an unexpected consideration from the old housekeeper, and I lit it to keep down any disposition to shiver, and when it was burning well, I stood round with my back to it, and regarded the room again. I had pulled up a chintz-covered armchair, and a table to form a kind of barricade before me. On this lay my revolver, ready to hand. My precise examination had done me a little good, but I still found the remoter darkness of the place and its perfect stillness too stimulating for the imagination. The echoing of the stir and crackling of the fire was no sort of comfort to me. The shadow in the alcove at the end of the room began to display that undefinable quality of a presence, that odd suggestion of a lurking, living thing that comes so easily in silence and solitude. And to reassure myself, I walked with a candle into it and satisfied myself that there was nothing tangible there. I stood that candle upon the floor of the alcove and left it in that position. By this time I was in a state of considerable nervous tension, although, to my reason, there was no adequate cause for my condition. My mind, however, was perfectly clear. I postulated quite unreservedly that nothing supernatural could happen, and to pass the time I began stringing some rhymes together, Ingoldsby fashion, concerning the original legend of the place. A few I spoke aloud, but the echoes were not pleasant. For the same reason I also abandoned, after a time, a conversation with myself upon the impossibility of ghosts and haunting. My mind reverted to the 3 old and distorted people downstairs, and I tried to keep it upon that topic. The sombre reds and greys of the room troubled me. Even with its 7 candles, the place was merely dim. The light in the alcove, flaring in a draught, and the fire flickering, kept the shadows and penumbra perpetually shifting and stirring in a noiseless, flighty dance. Casting about for a remedy, I recalled the wax candles I had seen in the corridor, and with a slight effort, carrying a candle and leaving the door open, I walked out into the moonlight and presently returned with as many as 10. These I put in the various knick-knacks of china, with which the room was sparsely adorned, and lit and placed them where the shadows had lain deepest, some on the floor, some in the window recesses, arranging and rearranging them, until at last my 17 candles were so placed that not an inch of the room but had the direct light of at least one of them. It occurred to me that when the ghost came, I could warn him not to trip over them. The room was now quite brightly illuminated. There was something very cheering and reassuring in these little silent, streaming flames, and to notice their steady diminution of length offered me an occupation, and gave me a reassuring sense of the passage of time. Even with that, however, the brooding expectation of the vigil weighed heavily enough upon me. I stood watching the minute hand of my watch creep towards midnight. Then something happened in the alcove. I did not see the candle go out. I simply turned and saw that the darkness was there, as one might start and see the unexpected presence of a stranger. The black shadow had sprung back to its place. "By Jove," said I aloud, recovering from my surprise. "That draft's a strong one." And taking the matchbox from the table, I walked across the room, in a leisurely manner, to relight the corner again. My first match would not strike, and as I succeeded with the second, something seemed to blink on the wall before me. I turned my head involuntarily, and saw that the 2 candles on the little table by the fireplace were extinguished. I rose at once to my feet. "Odd," I said. "Did I do that myself, in a flash of absent-mindedness?" I walked back, relit one, and as I did so, I saw the candle in the right sconce of one of the mirrors wink and go right out, and almost immediately its companion followed it. The flames vanished as if the wick had been suddenly nipped between a finger and thumb, leaving the wick neither glowing nor smoking, but black. While I stood, gaping, the candle at the foot of the bed went out, and the shadows seemed to take another step toward me. "This won't do," said I, and first one, and then another candle on the mantel-shelf followed. "What's up?" I cried, with a queer, high note getting into my voice somehow. At that, the candle on the corner of the wardrobe went out, and the one I had relit in the alcove followed. "Steady on," I said. "Those candles are wanted," speaking with a half-hysterical facetiousness, and scratching away at a match the while. "For the mantel candlesticks." My hands trembled so much that twice I missed the rough paper of the matchbox. As the mantel emerged from darkness again, 2 candles in the remoter end of the room were eclipsed. But with the same match I also relit the larger mirror candles, and those on the floor near the doorway, so that for the moment I seemed to gain on the extinctions. But then, in a noiseless volley, there vanished 4 lights at once, in different corners of the room, and I struck another match in quivering haste, and stood hesitating whither to take it. As I stood, undecided, an invisible hand seemed to sweep out the 2 candles on the table. With a cry of terror, I dashed at the alcove, then into the corner, and then into the window, relighting 3 as 2 more vanished by the fireplace, and then, perceiving a better way, I dropped the matches on the iron-bound deed-box in the corner and caught up the bedroom candlestick. With this I avoided the delay of striking matches, but for all that the steady process of extinction went on, and the shadows I feared and fought against returned, and crept in upon me. First a step gained on this side of me, then on that. I was now almost frantic with the horror of the coming darkness, and my self-possession deserted me. I leaped, panting from candle to candle, in a vain struggle against that remorseless advance. I bruised myself in the thigh against the table. I sent a chair headlong. I stumbled and fell, and whisked the cloth from the table in my fall. My candle rolled away from me, and I snatched another as I rose. Abruptly, this was blown out as I swung it off the table by the wind of my sudden movement, and immediately the 2 remaining candles followed. But there was light still in the room, a red light that streamed across the ceiling and staved off the shadows from me. The fire! Of course, I could still thrust my candle between the bars and relight it. I turned to where the flames were still dancing between the glowing coals and splashing red reflections upon the furniture, made 2 steps toward the grate, and incontinently the flames dwindled and vanished. The glow vanished. The reflections rushed together and disappeared, and as I thrust the candle between the bars, darkness closed upon me, like the shutting of an eye, wrapped about me in a stifling embrace, sealed my vision, and crushed the last vestiges of self-possession from my brain. And it was not only palpable darkness, but intolerable terror. The candle fell from my hands. I flung out my arms in a vain effort to thrust that ponderous blackness away from me, and lifting up my voice, screamed with all my might, once, twice, thrice. Then I think I must have staggered to my feet. I know I thought suddenly of the moonlit corridor, and with my head bowed and my arms over my face, made a stumbling run for the door. But I had forgotten the exact position of the door, and I struck myself heavily against the corner of the bed. I staggered back, turned, and was either struck or struck myself against some other bulky furnishing. I have a vague memory of battering myself thus to and fro in the darkness, of a heavy blow at last upon my forehead, of a horrible sensation of falling that lasted an age, of my last frantic effort to keep my footing, and then I remember no more. I opened my eyes in daylight. My head was roughly bandaged, and the man with the withered hand was watching my face. I looked about me, trying to remember what had happened, and for a space I could not recollect. I rolled my eyes into the corner, and saw the old woman, no longer abstracted, no longer terrible, pouring out some drops of medicine from a little blue phial into a glass. "Where am I?" I said. "I seem to remember you, and yet I cannot remember who you are." They told me then, and I heard of the haunted Red Room as one who hears a tale. "We found you at dawn," said he, "and there was blood on your forehead and lips." I wondered that I had ever disliked him. The 3 of them in the daylight seemed commonplace old folk enough. The man with the green shade had his head bent, as one who sleeps. It was very slowly I recovered the memory of my experience. "You believe now," said the old man with the withered hand, "that the room is haunted?" He spoke no longer as one who greets an intruder, but as one who condoles with a friend. Yes, said I. The room is haunted. And you have seen it, and we who have been here all our lives have never set eyes upon it, because we have never dared. Tell us, is it truly the old Earl who— No, said I, it is not. I told you so, said the old lady, with the glass in her hand. It is his poor young countess who was frightened. It is not, I said. There is neither ghost of Earl nor ghost of countess in that room. There is no ghost there at all, but worse, far worse, something impalpable. Well, they said. The worst of all the things that haunt poor mortal men, said I, and that is, in all its nakedness, fear. Fear that will not have light nor sound, that will not bear with reason, that deafens and darkens and overwhelms. It followed me through the corridor. It fought against me in the room. I stopped abruptly. There was an interval of silence. My hand went up to my bandages. The candles went out, one after another, and I fled. Then the man with the shade lifted his face sideways to see me, and spoke. That is it, said he. I knew that was it. A power of darkness, to put such a curse upon a home. It lurks there always. You can feel it, even in the daytime, even of a bright summer's day, in the hangings, in the curtains, keeping behind you, however you face about. In the dusk it creeps in the corridor and follows you, so that you dare not turn. It is even as you say. Fear itself is in that room. Black fear. And there it will be, so long as this house of sin endures. The Mystery of the Circular Chamber by L.T. Meade and Robert Eustace. One day in late September, I received the following letter from my lawyer. My dear Bell, I shall esteem it a favour if you can make it convenient to call upon me at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, on a matter of extreme privacy. At the appointed hour, I was shown into Mr. Edgecombe's private room. I had known him for years. We were, in fact, old friends, and I was startled now by the look of worry, not to say anxiety, on his usually serene features. "You are the very man I want, Bell," he cried. "Sit down. I have a great deal to say to you. There is a mystery of a very grave nature, which I hope you may solve for me. It is in connection with a house said to be haunted." He fixed his bright eyes on my face as he spoke. I sat perfectly silent, waiting for him to continue. "In the first place," he resumed, "I must ask you to regard the matter as confidential." "Certainly," I answered. "You know," he went on, "that I have often laughed at your special hobby, but it occurred to me yesterday that the experiences you have lived through may enable you to give me valuable assistance in this difficulty." "I will do my best for you, Edgecombe," I replied. He lay back in his chair, folding his hands. "The case is briefly as follows," he began. "It is connected with the family of the Wentworths. The only son, Archibald, the artist, has just died under most extraordinary circumstances. He was, as you probably know, one of the most promising watercolour painters of the younger school. and his pictures in this year's Academy met with universal praise. He was the heir to the Wentworth estates, and his death has caused a complication of claims from a member of a collateral branch of the family, who, when the present squire dies, is entitled to the money. This man has spent the greater part of his life in Australia, is badly off, and evidently belongs to a rowdy set. He has been to see me 2 or 3 times, and I must say, frankly, that I am not taken with his appearance." "Had he anything to do with the death?" I interrupted. "Nothing whatever, as you will quickly perceive. Wentworth has been accustomed from time to time to go alone on sketching tours to different parts of the country. He has tramped about on foot and visited odd out-of-the-way nooks, searching for subjects. He never took much money with him, and always travelled as an apparently poor man. A month ago he started off alone on one of these tours. He had a handsome commission from Barlow & Co., picture dealers in the Strand. He was to paint certain parts of the River Meron, and although he certainly did not need money, he seemed glad of an object for a good ramble. He parted with his family in the best of health and spirits, and wrote to them from time to time. But a week ago they heard the news that he had died suddenly at an inn on the Meron. There was, of course, an inquest and an autopsy. Dr. Miles Gordon, the Wentworth's consulting physician, was telegraphed for, and was present at the post-mortem examination. He is absolutely puzzled to account for the death. The medical examination showed Wentworth to be in apparently perfect health at the time. There was no lesion to be discovered upon which to base a different opinion, all the organs being healthy. Neither was there any trace of poison, nor marks of violence. The coroner's verdict was that Wentworth died of syncope, which, as you know, perhaps, is a synonym for an unknown cause. The inn where he died is a very lonely one, and has the reputation of being haunted. The landlord seems to bear a bad character, although nothing has ever been proved against him. But a young girl who lives at the inn gave evidence which at first startled everyone. She said at the inquest that she had earnestly warned Wentworth not to sleep in the haunted room. She had scarcely told the coroner so before she fell to the floor in an epileptic fit. When she came to herself, she was sullen and silent, and nothing more could be extracted from her. The old man, the innkeeper, explained that the girl was half-witted, but he did not attempt to deny that the house had the reputation of being haunted, and said that he had himself begged Wentworth not to put up there. Well, that is about the whole of the story. The coroner's inquest seems to deny the evidence of foul play, but I have my very strong suspicions. What I want you to do is to ascertain if they are correct. Will you undertake the case?" "I will certainly do so," I replied. "Please let me have any further particulars, and a written document to show, in case of need, that I am acting under your directions." Edgecombe agreed to this, and I soon afterwards took my leave. The case had the features of an interesting problem, and I hoped that I should prove successful in solving it. That evening I made my plans carefully. I would go into Blankshire early on the following morning, assuming for my purpose the character of an amateur photographer. Having got all necessary particulars from Edgecombe, I made a careful mental map of my operations. First of all, I would visit a little village of the name of Harkhurst, and put up at the inn, the Crown and Thistle. Here Wentworth had spent a fortnight when he first started on his commission to make drawings of the River Meron. I thought it likely that I should obtain some information there. Circumstances must guide me as to my further steps, but my intention was to proceed from Harkhurst to the Castle Inn, which was situated about 6 miles further up the river. This was the inn where the tragedy had occurred. Towards evening on the following day I arrived at Harkhurst. When my carriage drew up at the Crown and Thistle, the landlady was standing in the doorway. She was a buxom-looking dame with a kindly face. I asked for a bed. "Certainly, sir," she answered. She turned with me into the little inn, and taking me upstairs, showed me a small room, quite clean and comfortable, looking out on the yard. I said it would do capitally, and she hurried downstairs to prepare my supper. After this meal, which proved to be excellent, I determined to visit the landlord in the bar. I found him chatty and communicative. "This is a lonely place," he said. "We don't often have a soul staying with us for a month at a time." As he spoke, he walked to the door, and I followed him. The shades of night were beginning to fall, but the picturesqueness of the little hamlet could not but commend itself to me. "And yet it is a lovely spot," I said. "I should have thought tourists would have thronged to it. It is at least an ideal place for photographers." "You are right there, sir," replied the man. "And although we don't often have company to stay in the inn, now and then we have a stray artist. It's not 3 weeks back," he continued, "that we had a gentleman like you, sir, only a bit younger, to stay with us for a week or 2. He was an artist, and drew from morning till night. Ah, poor fellow." "Why do you say that?" I asked. "I have good cause, sir. Here, wife," continued the landlord, looking over his shoulder at Mrs. Johnson, the landlady, who now appeared on the scene. "This gentleman has been asking me questions about our visitor, Mr. Wentworth, but perhaps we ought not to inflict such a dismal story upon him tonight." "Pray do," I said. "What you have already hinted at arouses my curiosity. Why should you pity Mr. Wentworth?" "He is dead, sir," said the landlady in a solemn voice. I gave a pretended start, and she continued. "And it was all his own fault. Ah, dear, it makes me almost cry to think of it. He was as nice a gentleman as I ever set eyes on, and so strong, hearty, and pleasant. Well, sir, everything went well until one day he said to me, 'I am about to leave you, Mrs. Johnson. I am going to a little place called the Castle Inn, further up the Merron.' 'The Castle Inn?' I cried. 'No, Mr. Wentworth, that you won't, not if you value your life.' 'And why not?' he said, looking at me with as merry blue eyes as you ever saw in anybody's head. 'Why should I not visit the Castle Inn? I have a commission to make some drawings of that special bend of the river.' 'Well then, sir,' I answered, 'if that is the case, you'll just have a horse and trap from here, and drive over as often as you want to, for the Castle Inn ain't a fit place for a Christian to put up at.' 'What do you mean?' he asked of me. 'It is said to be haunted, sir, and what does happen in that house the Lord only knows, but there's not been a visitor at the inn for some years, not since Bailiff Holt came by his death.' 'Came by his death?' he asked. 'And how was that?' 'God knows, but I don't,' I answered. 'At the coroner's inquest it was said that he died from syncope, whatever that means, but the folks round here said it was fright. Mr. Wentworth just laughed at me. He didn't mind a word I said, and the next day, sir, he was off, carrying his belongings with him.' 'Well, and what happened?' I asked, seeing that she paused. 'What happened, sir? Just what I expected. 2 days afterwards came the news of his death. Poor young gentleman. He died in the very room where Holt had breathed his last, and oh, if there wasn't a fuss and to-do, for it turned out that, although he seemed quite poor to us, with little or no money, he was no end of a swell, and had rich relations, and big estates coming to him. And, of course, there was a coroner's inquest, and all the rest, and great doctors come down from London, and our Dr. Stanmore, who lives down the street, was sent for, and though they did all they could, and examined him, as it were, with a microscope, they could find no cause for death, and so they give it out that it was syncope, just as they did in the case of poor Holt. But, sir, it wasn't. It was fright, sheer fright. The place is haunted. It's a mysterious, dreadful house, and I only hope you won't have nothing to do with it." She added a few more words, and presently left us. "That's a strange story," I said, turning to Johnson. "Your wife has excited my curiosity. I should much like to get further particulars." "There don't seem to be anything more to tell, sir," replied Johnson. It's true what the wife says, that the Castle Inn has a bad name. It's not the first, no, nor the second death that has occurred there. You mentioned your village doctor. Do you think he could enlighten me on the subject? I am sure he would do his best, sir. He lives only 6 doors away, in a red house. Maybe you wouldn't mind stepping down the street and speaking to him. You are sure he would not think it a liberty? Not he, sir. He'll be only too pleased to exchange a word with someone outside this sleepy little place. Then I'll call on him, I answered, and taking up my hat, I strolled down the street. I was lucky in finding Dr. Stanmore at home, and the moment I saw his face, I determined to take him into my confidence. The fact is this, I said, when he had shaken hands with me. I should not dream of taking this liberty, did I not feel certain that you could help me. And in what way? He asked, not stiffly, but with a keen, inquiring, interested glance. I have been sent down from London to inquire into the Wentworth mystery, I said. Is that so? He said, with a start. Then he continued gravely. I fear you have come on a wild goose chase. There was nothing discovered at the autopsy to account for the death. There were no marks on the body, and all the organs were healthy. I met Wentworth often while he was staying here, and he was as hearty and strong-looking a young man as I have ever come across. But the Castle Inn has a bad reputation, I said. Well, that is true. The people here are afraid of it. It is said to be haunted, but really, sir, you and I need not trouble ourselves about stupid reports of that sort. Old Bindloss, the landlord, has lived there for years, and there has never been anything proved against him. Is he alone? No, his wife and a grandchild live there also. A grandchild, I said. Did not this girl give some startling evidence at the inquest? Nothing of any consequence, replied Dr. Stanmore. She only repeated what Bindloss had already said himself, that the house was haunted, and that she had asked Wentworth not to sleep in the room. Has anything ever been done to explain the reason why this room is said to be haunted? I continued. Not that I know of. Rats are probably at the bottom of it. But have not there been other deaths in the house? That is true. How many? Well, I have myself attended no less than 3 similar inquests. And what was the verdict of the jury? In each case, the verdict was death from syncope. Which means cause unknown, I said, jumping impatiently to my feet. I wonder, Dr. Stanmore, that you are satisfied to leave the matter in such a state. Well, and pray, what can I do? He inquired. I am asked to examine a body. I find all the organs in perfect health. I cannot trace the least appearance of violence, nor can I detect poison. What other evidence can I honestly give? I can only say that I should not be satisfied, I replied. I now wish to add that I have come down from London determined to solve this mystery. I shall myself put up at the Castle Inn. Well, said Dr. Stanmore. And sleep in the haunted room. Of course you don't believe in the ghost. No, but I believe in foul play. Now, Dr. Stanmore, will you help me? Oh, most certainly, if I can. What do you wish me to do? This. I shall go to the Castle Inn tomorrow. If, at the end of 3 days, I do not return here, will you go in search of me, and at the same time post this letter to Mr. Edgecombe, my London lawyer? If you do not appear in 3 days, I'll kick up no end of a row, said Dr. Stanmore. And, of course, post your letter. Soon afterwards, I shook hands with the doctor and left him. After an early dinner on the following day, I parted with my good-natured landlord and his wife, and with my knapsack and kodak strapped over my shoulders, started on my way. I took care to tell no one that I was going to the Castle Inn, and for this purpose doubled back through a wood, and so found the right road. The sun was nearly setting when at last I approached a broken-down signpost, on which, in half-obliterated characters, I could read the words, "To the Castle Inn." I found myself now at the entrance of a small lane, which was evidently little frequented, as it was considerably grass-grown. From where I stood I could catch no sight of any habitation, but just at that moment a low, somewhat inconsequent laugh fell upon my ears. I turned quickly and saw a pretty girl with bright eyes and a childish face gazing at me with interest. I had little doubt that she was old Bindloss's granddaughter. "Will you kindly tell me," I asked, "if this is the way to the Castle Inn?" My remark evidently startled her. She made a bound forward, seized me by my hand, and tried to push me away from the entrance to the lane into the high road. "Go away," she cried. "We have no beds fit for gentlemen at the Castle Inn. Go, go," she continued, and she pointed up the winding road. Her eyes were now blazing in her head, but I noticed that her lips trembled, and that very little would cause her to burst into tears. "But I am tired and footsore," I answered. "I should like to put up at the inn for the night." "Don't," she repeated. "They'll put you into a room with a ghost. Don't go. 'Tain't a place for gentlemen." Here she burst, not into tears, but into a fit of high, shrill, almost idiotic laughter. She suddenly clapped one of her hands to her forehead, and, turning, flew, almost as fast as the wind, down the narrow lane and out of sight. I followed her quickly. I did not believe that the girl was quite as mad as she seemed, but I had little doubt that she had something extraordinary weighing on her mind. At the next turn I came in view of the inn. It was a queer-looking old place, and I stopped for a moment to look at it. The house was entirely built of stone. There were 2 stories to the centre part, which was square, and at the 4 corners stood 4 round towers. The house was built right on the river, just below a large mill pond. I walked up to the door and pounded on it with my stick. It was shut, and looked as inhospitable as the rest of the place. After a moment's delay it was opened 2 or 3 inches, and the surly face of an old woman peeped out. "And what may you be wanting?" she asked. "A bed for the night," I replied. "Can you accommodate me?" She glanced suspiciously, first at me and then at my camera. "You are an artist, I make no doubt," she said, "and we don't want no more of them here." She was about to slam the door in my face, but I pushed my foot between it and the lintel. "I am easily pleased," I said. "Can you not give me some sort of bed for the night?" "You had best have nothing to do with us," she answered. "You go off to Harkhurst. They can put you up at the Crown and Thistle." "I have just come from there," I answered. As a matter of fact, I could not walk another mile. "We don't want visitors at the Castle Inn," she continued. Here she peered forward and looked into my face. "You had best be off," she repeated. "They say the place is haunted." I uttered a laugh. "You don't expect me to believe that," I said. She glanced at me from head to foot. Her face was ominously grave. "You had best know all, sir," she said, after a pause. "Something happens in this house, and no living soul knows what it is, for they who have seen it have never yet survived to tell the tale. It's not more than a week back that a young gentleman came here. He was like you, bold as brass, and he too wanted a bed and would take no denial. I told him plain, and so did my man, that the place was haunted. He didn't mind no more than you mind. Well, he slept in the only room we have got for guests, and he died there." "What did he die of?" I asked. "Fright," was the answer, brief and laconic. "Now, do you want to come or not?" "Yes, I don't believe in ghosts. I want the bed, and I am determined to have it." The woman flung the door wide open. "Don't say as I ain't warned you," she cried. "Come in, if you must." She led me into the kitchen, where a fire burned sullenly on the hearth. "Sit you down, and I'll send for Bindloss," she said. "I can only promise to give you a bed if Bindloss agrees. Liz, come along here this minute." A quick young step was heard in the passage, and the pretty girl whom I had seen at the top of the lane entered. Her eyes sought my face. Her lips moved as if to say something, but no sound issued from them. "Go and find your grandad," said the old woman. "Tell him there is a gentleman here that wants a bed. Ask him what's to be done." The girl favoured me with a long and peculiar glance. Then, turning on her heel, she left the room. As soon as she did so, the old woman peered forward and looked curiously at me. "I'm sorry you are staying," she said. "Don't forget as I warned you. Remember, this ain't a proper inn at all. Once it was a mill, but that was afore Bindloss's day and mine. Gents would come in the summer and put up for the fishing, but then the story of the ghost got abroad, and lately we have had no visitors to speak of. Only an odd one now and then, who ain't wanted. No, he ain't wanted. You see, there was 3 deaths here. Yes." She held up one of her skinny hands, and began to count on her fingers. "Yes, 3 up to the present. 3, that's it. Ah, here comes Bindloss." A shuffling step was heard in the passage, and an old man, bent with age and wearing a long white beard, entered the room. "We has no beds for strangers," he said, speaking in an aggressive and loud tone. "Hasn't the wife said so? We don't let out beds here." "As that is the case, you have no right to have that signpost at the end of the lane," I retorted. "I am not in a mood to walk 8 miles for a shelter in a country I know nothing about. Cannot you put me up somehow?" "I have told the gentleman everything, Sam," said the wife. "He is just for all the world like young Mr. Wentworth, and not a bit frightened." The old landlord came up and faced me. "Look you here," he said. "You stay on at your peril. I don't want you, nor do the wife. Now, is it yes or no?" "It is yes," I said. "There's only one room you can sleep in." "One room is sufficient." "It's the one Mr. Wentworth died in. Hadn't you best take up your traps and be off?" "No, I shall stay." "Then there's no more to be said. Run, Liz," said the woman, "and light the fire in the parlour." The girl left the room, and the woman, taking up a candle, said she would take me to the chamber where I was to sleep. She led me down a long and narrow passage, and then, opening a door, down 2 steps into the most extraordinary-looking room I had ever seen. The walls were completely circular, covered with a paper of a staring, grotesque pattern. A small iron bedstead projected into the middle of the floor, which was uncarpeted except for a slip of matting beside it. A cheap deal wash-hand stand, a couple of chairs, and a small table with a blurred looking-glass stood against the wall beneath a deep embrasure, in which there was a window. This was evidently a room in one of the circular towers. I had never seen less inviting quarters. "Your supper will be ready directly, sir," said the woman, and placing the candle on the little table, she left me. The place felt damp and draughty, and the flame of the candle flickered about, causing the tallow to gutter to one side. There was no fireplace in the room, and above the walls converged to a point, giving the whole place the appearance of an enormous extinguisher. I made a hurried and necessarily limited toilet, and went into the parlour. I was standing by the fire, which was burning badly, when the door opened, and the girl Liz came in, bearing a tray in her hand. She laid the tray on the table, and came up softly to me. "Fools come to this house," she said, "and you are one." "Pray let me have my supper, and don't talk," I replied. "I am tired and hungry, and want to go to bed." Liz stood perfectly still for a moment. "'Tain't worth it," she said. Then, in a meditative voice, said, No, 'tain't worth it. But I'll say no more. Folks will never be warned." Her grandmother's voice, calling her, caused her to bound from the room. My supper proved better than I had expected, and having finished it, I strolled into the kitchen, anxious to have a further talk with the old man. He was seated alone by the fire, a great mastiff lying at his feet. "Can you tell me why the house is supposed to be haunted?" I asked suddenly, stooping down to speak to him. "How should I know?" he cried hoarsely. "The wife and me have been here 20 years, and never seen nor heard anything. But for certain, folks do die in the house. It's mortal unpleasant for me, for the doctors come along, and the coroner, and there's an inquest, and no end of fuss. The folks die, although no one has ever laid a finger on 'em. The doctors can't prove why they are dead, but dead they be. Well, there ain't no use saying more. You are here, and maybe you'll pass the one night all right." "I shall go to bed at once," I said, "but I should like some candles. Can you supply me?" The man turned and looked at his wife, who at that moment entered the kitchen. She went to the dresser, opened a wooden box, and taking out 3 or 4 tallow candles, put them into my hand. I rose, simulating a yawn. "Good night, sir," said the old man. "Good night. I wish you well." A moment later I had entered my bedroom, and, having shut the door, proceeded to give it a careful examination. As far as I could make out, there was no entrance to the room except by the door, which was shaped to fit the circular walls. I noticed, however, that there was an unaccountable draught, and this, I at last discovered, came from below the oak wainscoting of the wall. I could not in any way account for the draught, but it existed to an unpleasant extent. The bed, I further saw, was somewhat peculiar. It had no casters on the 4 legs, which were let down about half an inch into sockets provided for them in the wooden floor. This discovery excited my suspicions still further. It was evident that the bed was intended to remain in a particular position. I saw that it directly faced the little window sunk deep into the thick wall, so that anyone in bed would look directly at the window. I examined my watch, found that it was past 11, and placing both the candles on a tiny table near the bed, I lay down without undressing. I was on the alert to catch the slightest noise, but the hours dragged on, and nothing occurred. In the house all was silence, and outside the splashing and churning of the water falling over the wheel came distinctly to my ears. I lay awake all night, but, as morning dawned, fell into an uneasy sleep. I awoke to see the broad daylight streaming in at the small window. Making a hasty toilet, I went out for a walk, and presently came in to breakfast. It had been laid for me in the big kitchen, and the old man was seated by the hearth. "Well," said the woman, "I hope you slept comfortable, sir." I answered in the affirmative, and now perceived that old Bindloss and his wife were in the humour to be agreeable. They said that if I was satisfied with the room, I might spend another night at the inn. I told them that I had a great many photographs to take, and would be much obliged for the permission. As I spoke, I looked round for the girl, Liz. She was nowhere to be seen. "Where is your granddaughter?" I asked of the old woman. "She has gone away for the day," was the reply. "It's too much for Liz to see strangers. She gets excited, and then the fits come on." "What sort of fits?" "I can't tell what they are called, but they're bad and weaken her, poor thing. Liz ought never to be excited." Here Bindloss gave his wife a warning glance. She lowered her eyes, and going across to the range, began to stir the contents of something in a saucepan. That afternoon I borrowed some lines from Bindloss, and, taking an old boat which was moored to the bank of the mill-pond, set off under the pretence of fishing for pike. The weather was perfect for the time of year. Waiting my opportunity, I brought the boat up to land on the bank that dammed up the stream, and getting out, walked along it in the direction of the mill wheel, over which the water was now rushing. As I observed it from this side of the bank, I saw that the tower in which my room was placed must at one time have been part of the mill itself, and I further noticed that the masonry was comparatively new, showing that alterations must have taken place when the house was abandoned as a mill and was turned into an inn. I clambered down the side of the wheel, holding on to the beams, which were green and slippery, and peered through the paddles. As I was making my examination, a voice suddenly startled me. "What are you doing down there?" I looked up. Old Bindloss was standing on the bank, looking down at me. He was alone, and his face was contorted with a queer mixture of fear and passion. I hastily hoisted myself up, and stood beside him. "What are you poking about down there for?" he said, pushing his ugly old face into mine as he spoke. "You fool! If you had fallen, you would have been drowned. No one could swim a stroke in that mill race, and then there would have been another death, and all the old fuss over again. Look here, sir, will you have the goodness to get out of the place? I don't want you here any more." "I intend to leave tomorrow morning," I answered in a pacifying voice, "and I am really very much obliged to you for warning me about the mill." "You had best not go near it again," he said in a menacing voice, and then he turned hastily away. I watched him as he climbed up a steep bank and disappeared from view. He was going in the opposite direction from the house. Seizing the opportunity of his absence, I once more approached the mill. Was it possible that Wentworth had been hurled into it? But had this been the case, there would have been signs and marks on the body. Having reached the wheel, I clambered boldly down. It was now getting dusk, but I could see that a prolongation of the axle entered the wall of the tower. The fittings were also in wonderfully good order, and the bolt that held the great wheel only required to be drawn out to set it in motion. That evening, during supper, I thought very hard. I perceived that Bindloss was angry, also that he was suspicious and alarmed. I saw plainly that the only way to really discover what had been done to Wentworth was to cause the old ruffian to try similar means to get rid of me. This was a dangerous expedient, but I felt desperate, and my curiosity as well as interest were keenly aroused. Having finished my supper, I went into the passage, preparatory to going into the kitchen. I had on felt slippers, and my footfall made no noise. As I approached the door, I heard Bindloss saying to his wife, "He's been poking about the mill wheel. I wish he would make himself scarce." "Oh, we can't find out anything," was the reply. "You keep quiet, Bindloss. He'll be off in the morning." "That's as may be," was the answer, and then there came a harsh and very disagreeable laugh. I waited for a moment, and then entered the kitchen. Bindloss was alone now. He was bending over the fire, smoking. "I shall leave early in the morning," I said, "so please have my bill ready for me." I then seated myself near him, drawing up my chair close to the blaze. He looked as if he resented this, but said nothing. "I am very curious about the deaths which occur in this house," I said, after a pause. "How many did you say there were?" "That is nothing to you," he answered. "We never wanted you here. You can go when you please." "I shall go tomorrow morning, but I wish to say something now." "And what may that be?" "I don't believe in that story about the place being haunted." "Oh, you don't you?" He dropped his pipe, and his glittering eyes gazed at me with a mixture of anger and ill-concealed alarm. "No." I paused. Then I said slowly and emphatically, "I went back to the mill. even after your warning. And—" "What?" he cried, starting to his feet. "Nothing," I answered. "Only I don't believe in the ghost." His face turned not only white but livid. I left him without another word. I saw that his suspicions had been much strengthened by my words. This I intended. To induce the ruffian to do his worst was the only way to wring his secret from him. My hideous room looked exactly as it had done on the previous evening. The grotesque pattern on the walls seemed to start out in bold relief. Some of the ugly lines seemed at that moment, to my imagination, almost to take human shape, to convert themselves into ogre-like faces, and to grin at me. Was I too daring? Was it wrong of me to risk my life in this manner? I was terribly tired, and, curious as it may seem, my greatest fear at that crucial moment was the dread that I might fall asleep. I had spent 2 nights with scarcely any repose, and felt that at any moment, notwithstanding all my efforts, slumber might visit me. In order to give Bindloss full opportunity for carrying out his scheme, it was necessary for me to get into bed, and even to feign sleep. In my present exhausted condition, the pretence of slumber would easily lapse into the reality. This risk, however, which really was a very grave one, must be run. Without undressing, I got into bed, pulling the bedclothes well over me. In my hand I held my revolver. I deliberately put out the candles, and then lay motionless, waiting for events. The house was quiet as the grave. There was not a stir, and gradually my nerves, excited as they were, began to calm down. As I had fully expected, overpowering sleepiness seized me, and, notwithstanding every effort, I found myself drifting away into the land of dreams. I began to wish that whatever apparition was to appear would do so at once and get it over. Gradually, but surely, I seemed to pass from all memory of my present world, and to live in a strange and terrible phantasmagoria. In that state I slept. In that state also I dreamt, and dreamt horribly. I thought that I was dancing a waltz with an enormously tall woman. She towered above me, clasping me in her arms, and began to whirl me round and round at a giddy speed. I could hear the crashing music of a distant band. Faster and faster, round and round some great empty hall was I whirled. I knew that I was losing my senses, and screamed to her to stop and let me go. Suddenly there was a terrible crash close to me. Good God! I found myself awake, but I was still moving. Where was I? Where was I going? I leapt up on the bed, only to reel and fall heavily backwards upon the floor. What was the matter? Why was I sliding? Had I suddenly gone mad, or was I still suffering from some hideous nightmare? I tried to move, to stagger to my feet. Then, by slow degrees, my senses began to return, and I knew where I was. I was in the circular room, the room where Wentworth had died. But what was happening to me I could not divine. I only knew that I was being whirled round and round at a velocity that was every moment increasing. By the moonlight that struggled in through the window, I saw that the floor and the bed upon it was revolving, but the table was lying on its side, and its fall must have awakened me. I could not see any other furniture in the room. By what mysterious manner had it been removed? Making a great effort, I crawled to the centre of this awful chamber, and, seizing the foot of the bed, struggled to my feet. Here I knew there would be less motion, and I could just manage to see the outline of the door. I had taken the precaution to slip the revolver into my pocket, and I still felt that if human agency appeared, I had a chance of selling my life dearly. But surely the horror I was passing through was invented by no living man. As the floor of the room revolved in the direction of the door, I made a dash for it, but was carried swiftly past, and again fell heavily. When I came round again, I made a frantic effort to cling to one of the steps, but in vain. The head of the bedstead caught me as it flew round and tore my arms away. In another moment I believe I should have gone raving mad with terror. My head felt as if it would burst. I found it impossible to think consecutively. The only idea which really possessed me was a mad wish to escape from this hideous place. I struggled to the bedstead, and, dragging the legs from their sockets, pulled it into the middle of the room, away from the wall. With this out of the way, I managed at last to reach the door in safety. The moment my hand grasped the handle, I leapt upon the little step and tried to wrench the door open. It was locked from without. It defied my every effort. I had only just standing room for my feet. Below me, the floor of the room was still racing round, with terrible speed. I dared scarcely look at it, for the giddiness in my head increased each moment. The next instant, a soft footstep was distinctly audible, and I saw a gleam of light through a chink of the door. I heard a hand fumbling at the lock. The door was slowly opened outwards, and I saw the face of Bindloss. For a moment he did not perceive me, for I was crouching down on the step, and the next instant, with all my force, I flung myself upon him. He uttered a yell of terror. The lantern he carried dropped and went out, but I had gripped him round the neck with my fingers, driving them deep down into his lean, sinewy throat. With frantic speed I pulled him along the passage up to a window, through which the moonlight was shining. Here I released my hold of his throat, but immediately covered him with my revolver. "Down on your knees, or you are a dead man," I cried. "Confess everything, or I shoot you through the heart." His courage had evidently forsaken him. He began to whimper and cry bitterly. "Spare my life!" he screamed. "I will tell everything, only spare my life." "Be quick about it," I said. "I am in no humour to be merciful. Out with the truth." I was listening anxiously for the wife's step, but except for the low hum of machinery and the splashing of the water, I heard nothing. "Speak," I said, giving the old man a shake. His lips trembled. His words came out falteringly. "It was Wentworth's doing," he panted. "Wentworth? Not the murdered man?" I cried. No, his cousin, the ruffian who has been the curse of my life. Owing to that last death, he inherits the property. He is the real owner of the mill, and he invented the revolving floor. There were deaths. Oh, yes, it was so easy, and I wanted the money. The police never suspected, nor did the doctors. Wentworth was bitter hard on me, and I got into his power." Here he choked and sobbed. "I am a miserable old man, sir," he gasped. "So you killed your victims for the sake of money?" I said, grasping him by the shoulder. "Yes," he said. "Yes, the bailiff had £20, all in gold. No one ever knew. I took it, and was able to satisfy Wentworth for a bit." "And what about Archibald Wentworth?" "That was his doing, and I was to be paid." "And now, finally, you wanted to get rid of me?" "Yes, for you suspected." As I spoke, I perceived, by the ghastly light of the moon, another door near. I opened it and saw that it was the entrance to a small, dark lumber room. I pushed the old man in, turned the key in the lock, and ran downstairs. The wife was still unaccountably absent. I opened the front door, and trembling, exhausted, drenched in perspiration, found myself in the open air. Every nerve was shaken. At that terrible moment I was not in the least master of myself. My one desire was to fly from the hideous place. I had just reached the little gate when a hand, light as a feather, touched my arm. I looked up. The girl Liz stood before me. "You are saved," she said. "Thank God! I tried all I could to stop the wheel. See, I am drenched to the skin. I could not manage it. But at least I locked Granny up. She's in the kitchen, sound asleep. She drank a lot of gin." "Where were you all day yesterday?" I asked. "Locked up in a room in the further tower, but I managed to squeeze through the window, though it half killed me. I knew if you stayed that they would try it on tonight. Thank God you are saved." "Well, don't keep me now," I said. "I have been saved as by a miracle. You are a good girl. I am much obliged to you. You must tell me another time how you managed to live through all these horrors." "Ain't I all but mad?" was her pathetic reply. "Oh, my God, what I suffer!" She pressed her hand to her face. The look in her eyes was terrible. But I could not wait now to talk to her further. I hastily left the place. How I reached Harghurst I can never tell, but early in the morning I found myself there. I went straight to Dr. Stanmore's house, and having got him up, I communicated my story. He and I, together, immediately visited the superintendent of police. Having told my exciting tale, we took a trap, and all three returned to the Castle Inn. We were back there before 8 o'clock on the following morning. But, as the police officer expected, the place was empty. Bindloss had been rescued from the dark closet, and he and his wife and the girl Liz had all flown. The doctor, the police officer, and I all went up to the circular room. We then descended to the basement, and after a careful examination we discovered a low door, through which we crept. We then found ourselves in a dark vault, which was full of machinery. By the light of a lantern we examined it. Here we saw an explanation of the whole trick. The shaft of the mill wheel, which was let through the wall of the tower, was continuous as the axle of a vertical cogged wheel, and by a multiplication action turned a large horizontal wheel, into which a vertical shaft descended. This shaft was let into the centre of 4 crossbeams, supporting the floor of the room in which I had slept. All round the circular edge of the floor was a steel rim, which turned in a circular socket. It needed but a touch to set this hideous apparatus in motion. The police immediately started in pursuit of Bindloss, and I returned to London. That evening, Edgecombe and I visited Dr. Miles Gordon. Hard-headed old physician that he was literally aghast when I told him my story. He explained to me that a man placed in the position in which I was when the floor began to move would, by means of centrifugal force, suffer from enormous congestion of the brain. In fact, the revolving floor would induce an artificial condition of apoplexy. If the victim were drugged, or even only sleeping heavily, and the floor began to move slowly, insensibility would almost immediately be induced, which would soon pass into coma and death, and a post-mortem examination, some hours afterwards, would show no cause for death, as the brain would appear perfectly healthy, the blood having again left it. From the presence of Dr. Miles Gordon, Edgecombe and I went to Scotland Yard, and the whole affair was put into the hands of the London detective force. With the clue which I had almost sacrificed my life to furnish, they quickly did the rest. Wentworth was arrested, and under pressure was induced to make a full confession, but old Bindloss had already told me the gist of the story. Wentworth's father had owned the mill, had got into trouble with the law and changed his name. In fact, he had spent 5 years in penal servitude. He then went to Australia and made money. He died when his son was a young man. This youth inherited all the father's vices. He came home, visited the mill, and, being of a mechanical turn of mind, invented the revolving floor. He changed the mill into an inn, put Bindloss, one of his pals, into possession, with the full intention of murdering unwary travellers from time to time for their money. The police, however, wanted him for a forged bill, and he thought it best to fly. Bindloss was left in full possession. Worried by Wentworth, who had him in his power for a grave crime committed years ago, he himself, on 2 occasions, murdered a victim in the circular room. Meanwhile, several unexpected deaths had taken place in the older branch of the Wentworth family, and Archibald Wentworth alone stood between his cousin and the great estates. Wentworth came home, and with the aid of Bindloss, got Archibald into his power. The young artist slept in the fatal room, and his death was the result. At this moment, Wentworth and Bindloss are committed for trial at the Old Bailey, and there is no doubt what the result will be. The ghost mystery, in connection with the Castle Inn, has, of course, been explained away forever. The Thing in the Upper Room by Arthur Morrison. A shadow hung ever over the door, which stood black in the depth of its arched recess, like an unfathomable eye under a frowning brow. The landing was wide and panelled, and a heavy rail, supported by a carved balustrade, stretched away in alternate slopes and levels down the dark staircase, past other doors, and so to the courtyard and the street. The other doors were dark also, but it was with a difference. That top landing was lightest of all, because of the skylight, and perhaps it was largely by reason of contrast that its one doorway gloomed so black and forbidding. The doors below opened and shut, slammed, stood ajar. Men and women passed in and out, with talk and human sounds, sometimes even with laughter or a snatch of song. But the door on the top landing remained shut and silent through weeks and months. For, in truth, the logement had an ill name, and had been untenanted for years, long even before the last tenant had occupied it. The room had been regarded with fear and aversion, and the end of that last tenant had in no way lightened the gloom that hung about the place. The house was so old that its weather-washed face may well have looked down on the bloodshed of St. Bartholomew's, and the haunted room may even have earned its ill name on that same day of death. But Paris is a city of cruel history, and since the old mansion rose, proud and new, the hotel of some powerful noble, almost any year of the centuries might have seen the blot fall on that upper room that had left it a place of loathing and shadows. The occasion was long forgotten, but the fact remained. Whether or not some horror of the Ancien Régime, or some enormity of the terror, was enacted in that room, was no longer to be discovered. But nobody would live there. nor stay beyond that gloomy door 1 second longer than he could help. It might be supposed that the fate of the solitary tenant within living memory had something to do with the matter, and, indeed, his end was sinister enough. But long before his time, the room had stood shunned and empty. He, greatly daring, had taken no more heed of the common terror of the room than to use it to his advantage in abating the rent. And he had shot himself a little later, while the police were beating at his door to arrest him on a charge of murder. As I have said, his fate may have added to the general aversion from the place, though it had in no way originated it, and now 10 years had passed, and more, since his few articles of furniture had been carried away and sold, and nothing had been carried in to replace them. When one is 25, healthy, hungry, and poor, one is less likely to be frightened from a cheap lodging by mere head-shakings than might be expected in other circumstances. Atwater was 25, commonly healthy, often hungry, and always poor. He came to live in Paris because, from his remembrance of his student days, he believed he could live cheaper there than in London, while it was quite certain that he would not sell fewer pictures, since he had never yet sold one. It was the concierge of a neighbouring house who showed Atwater the room. The house of the room itself maintained no such functionary, though its main door stood open day and night. The man said little, but his surprise at Atwater's application was plain to see. Monsieur was English? Yes. The logement was convenient, though high, and probably now a little dirty, since it had not been occupied recently. Plainly, the man felt it to be no business of his to enlighten an unsuspecting foreigner as to the reputation of the place, and if he could let it, there would be some small gratification from the landlord, though at such a rent, of course a very small one indeed. But Atwater was better informed than the concierge supposed. He had heard the tale of the haunted room, vaguely and incoherently, it is true, from the little old engraver of watches on the floor below, by whom he had been directed to the concierge. The old man had been voluble and friendly, and reported that the room had a good light, facing north-east, indeed a much better light than he, engraver of watches, enjoyed on the floor below. So much so that, considering this advantage and the much lower rent, he himself would have taken the room long ago, except for other things. Monsieur was a stranger, and perhaps had no fear to inhabit a haunted chamber, but that was its reputation, as everybody in the quarter knew. It would be a misfortune, however, to a stranger to take the room without suspicion, and to undergo unexpected experiences. Here, however, the old man checked himself, possibly reflecting that too much information to inquirers after the upper room might offend his landlord. He hinted as much, in fact, hoping that his friendly warning would not be allowed to travel farther. As to the precise nature of the disagreeable manifestations in the room, who could say? Perhaps there were really none at all. People said this and that. Certainly the place had been untenanted for many years, and he would not like to stay in it himself. But it might be the good fortune of Monsieur to break the spell, and if Monsieur was resolved to defy the revenant, he wished Monsieur the highest success and happiness. So much for the engraver of watches. And now the concierge of the neighbouring house led the way up the stately old panelled staircase, swinging his keys in his hand, and halted at last before the dark door in the frowning recess. He turned the key with some difficulty, pushed open the door, and stood back, with an action of something not wholly deference, to allow Atwater to enter first. A sort of small lobby had been partitioned off at some time, though, except for this, the logement was of one large room only, There was something unpleasant in the air of the place. Not a smell, when one came to analyse one's sensations, though at first it might seem so. Atwater walked across to the wide window, and threw it open. The chimneys and roofs of many houses, of all ages, straggled before him, and out of the welter rose the twin towers of Saint-Sulpice, scarred and grim. Ere the room as one might, it was unpleasant. A sickly, even a cowed feeling invaded one through all the senses, or perhaps through none of them. The feeling was there, though it was not easy to say by what channel it penetrated. Atwater was resolved to admit none but a common-sense explanation, and blamed the long closing of door and window. And the concierge, standing uneasily near the door, agreed that that must be it. For a moment Atwater wavered, despite himself. But the rent was very low, and, low as it was, he could not afford a sou more. The light was good, though it was not a top light, and the place was big enough for his simple requirements. Atwater reflected that he should despise himself ever after if he shrank from the opportunity. It would be one of those secret humiliations that will rise again and again in a man's memory and make him blush in solitude. He told the concierge to leave door and window wide open for the rest of the day, and he clinched the bargain. It was with something of amused bravado that he reported to his few friends in Paris his acquisition of a haunted room. For, once out of the place, he readily convinced himself that his disgust and dislike, while in the room, were the result of imagination, and nothing more. Certainly there was no rational reason to account for the unpleasantness. Consequently, what could it be but a matter of fancy? He resolved to face the matter from the beginning, and clear his mind from any foolish prejudices that the hints of the old engraver might have inspired, by forcing himself through whatever adventures he might encounter. In fact, as he walked the streets about his business, and arranged for the purchase and delivery of the few simple articles of furniture that would be necessary, his enterprise assumed the guise of a pleasing adventure. He remembered that he had made an attempt, only a year or two ago, to spend a night in a house reputed haunted in England, but had failed to find the landlord. Here was the adventure to hand, with promise of a tale to tell in future times, and a welcome idea struck him that he might look out the ancient history of the room and work the whole thing into a magazine article which would bring a little money. So simple were his needs that by the afternoon of the day following his first examination of the room it was ready for use. He took his bag from the cheap hotel in a little street of Montparnasse, where he had been lodging, and carried it to his new home. The key was now in his pocket, and for the first time he entered the place alone. The window remained wide open, but it was still there, that depressing, choking something that entered the consciousness, he knew not by what gate. Again he accused his fancy. He stamped and whistled, and set about unpacking a few canvases and a case of old Oriental weapons that were part of his professional properties. But he could give no proper attention to the work, and detected himself more than once yielding to a childish impulse to look over his shoulder. He laughed at himself, with some effort, and sat determinedly to smoke a pipe and grow used to his surroundings. But presently he found himself pushing his chair farther and farther back, till it touched the wall. He would take the whole room into view, he said to himself in excuse, and stare it out of countenance. So he sat and smoked, and as he sat his eye fell on a Malay dagger that lay on the table between him and the window. It was a murderous, twisted thing, and its pommel was fashioned into the semblance of a bird's head, with curved beak and an eye of some dull red stone. He found himself gazing on this red eye with an odd, mindless fascination. The dagger, in its wicked curves, seemed now a creature of some outlandish fantasy, a snake with a beaked head, a thing of nightmare, in some new way dominant, overruling the centre of his perceptions. The rest of the room grew dim, but the red stone glowed with a fuller light. Nothing more was present to his consciousness. Then, with a sudden clang, the heavy bell of Saint-Sulpice aroused him, and he started up in some surprise. There lay the dagger on the table, strange and murderous enough, but merely as he had always known it. He observed with more surprise, however, that his chair, which had been back against the wall, was now some 6 feet forward, close by the table. Clearly, he must have drawn it forward in his abstraction, towards the dagger on which his eyes had been fixed. The great bell of Saint-Sulpice went clanging on, repeating its monotonous call to the Angelus. He was cold, almost shivering. He flung the dagger into a drawer and turned to go out. He saw by his watch that it was later than he had supposed. His fit of abstraction must have lasted some time. Perhaps he had even been dozing. He went slowly downstairs and out into the streets. As he went, he grew more and more ashamed of himself, for he had to confess that in some inexplicable way he feared that room. He had seen nothing, heard nothing of the kind that one might have expected, or had heard of, in any room reputed haunted. He could not help thinking that it would have been some sort of relief if he had. But there was an all-pervading, overpowering sense of another presence, something abhorrent, not human, something almost physically nauseous. Withal, it was something more than presence. It was power, domination. So he seemed to remember it. And yet the remembrance grew weaker as he walked in the gathering dusk. He thought of a story he had once read of a haunted house, wherein it was shown that the house actually was haunted by the spirit of fear, and nothing else. That, he persuaded himself, was the case with his room. He felt angry at the growing conviction that he had allowed himself to be overborne by fancy, by the spirit of fear. He returned that night with the resolve to allow himself no foolish indulgence. He had heard nothing, and had seen nothing. When something palpable to the senses occurred, it would be time enough to deal with it. He took off his clothes and got into bed deliberately, leaving candle and matches at hand in case of need. He had expected to find some difficulty in sleeping, or at least some delay, but he was scarce well in bed ere he fell into a heavy sleep. Dazzling sunlight through the window woke him in the morning, and he sat up, staring sleepily about him. He must have slept like a log, but he had been dreaming. The dreams were horrible. His head ached beyond anything he had experienced before, and he was far more tired than when he went to bed. He sank back on the pillow, but the mere contact made his head ring with pain. He got out of bed and found himself staggering. It was all as though he had been drunk, unspeakably drunk, with bad liquor. His dreams, they had been horrid dreams. He could remember that they had been bad, but what they actually were was now gone from him entirely. He rubbed his eyes and stared amazedly down at the table, where the crooked dagger lay, with its bird's head and red stone eye. It lay just as it had lain when he sat gazing at it yesterday, and yet he would have sworn that he had flung that same dagger into a drawer. Perhaps he had dreamed it. At any rate, he put the thing carefully into the drawer now. and, still with his ringing headache, dressed himself and went out. As he reached the next landing, the old engraver greeted him from his door with an inquiring good day. "Monsieur has not slept well, I fear?" In some doubt, Atwater protested that he had slept quite soundly. "And, as yet, I have neither seen nor heard anything of the ghost," he added. "Nothing?" replied the old man, with a lift of the eyebrows. "Nothing at all. It is fortunate. It seemed to me, here below, that monsieur was moving about very restlessly in the night. But no doubt I was mistaken. No doubt also I may felicitate monsieur on breaking the evil tradition. We shall hear no more of it. Monsieur has the good fortune of a brave heart." He smiled and bowed pleasantly, but it was with something of a puzzled look that his eyes followed Atwater descending the staircase. Atwater took his coffee and roll after an hour's walk, and fell asleep in his seat. Not for long, however, and presently he rose and left the café. He felt better, though still unaccountably fatigued. He caught sight of his face in a mirror beside a shop window, and saw an improvement since he had looked in his own glass. That, indeed, had brought him a shock. Worn and drawn beyond what might have been expected of so bad a night. There was even something more. What was it? How should it remind him of that old legend? Was it Japanese? Which he had tried to recollect when he had wondered confusedly at the haggard apparition that confronted him. Some tale of a demon-possessed person who, in any mirror, saw never his own face, but the face of the demon. Work he felt to be impossible, and he spent the day on garden seats, at café tables, and, for a while, in the Luxembourg. And in the evening he met an English friend, who took him by the shoulders and looked into his eyes, shook him, and declared that he had been overworking, and needed, above all things, a good dinner, which he should have instantly. "You'll dine with me," he said, "at La Perouse, and we'll get a cab to take us there. I'm hungry." As they stood and looked for a passing cab, a man ran shouting with newspapers. "We'll have a cab," Atwater's friend repeated, "and we'll take the new murder with us for conversation's sake. Hi, journal." He bought a paper and followed Atwater into the cab. "I've a strong idea I knew the poor old boy by sight," he said. "I believe he'd seen better days." "Who?" "The old man who was murdered in the Rue Broca last night. The description fits exactly. He used to hang about the cafes and ran messages. It isn't easy to read in this cab, but there's probably nothing fresh in this edition. They haven't caught the murderer, anyhow." Atwater took the paper and struggled to read it in the changing light. A poor old man had been found dead on the footpath of the Rue Broca, torn with a score of stabs. He had been identified, an old man, not known to have a friend in the world. Also, because he was so old and so poor, probably not an enemy. There was no robbery. The few sous the old man possessed remained in his pocket. He must have been attacked on his way home in the early hours of the morning, possibly by a homicidal maniac, and stabbed again and again with inconceivable fury. No arrest had been made. Atwater pushed the paper away. "Pah," he said. "I don't like it. I'm a bit off colour, and I was dreaming horribly all last night, though why this should remind me of it I can't guess. But it's no cure for the blues, this." "No," replied his friend heartily. "We'll get that upstairs, for here we are on the quay. A bottle of the best Burgundy on the list, and the best dinner they can do. That's your physic. Come." It was a good prescription, indeed. Atwater's friend was cheerful and assiduous, and nothing could have bettered the dinner. Atwater found himself reflecting that indulgence in the blues was a poor pastime, with no better excuse than a bad night's rest. And last night's dinner, in comparison with this, well, it was enough to have spoiled his sleep, that £1.50 dinner. Atwater left La Perouse as gay as his friend. They had sat late, and now there was nothing to do but cross the water and walk a little in the boulevard. This they did, and finished the evening at a café table with half a dozen acquaintances. Atwater walked home with a light step, feeling less drowsy than at any time during the day. He was well enough. He felt he should soon get used to the room. He had been a little too much alone lately, and that had got on his nerves. It was simply stupid. Again he slept quickly and heavily, and dreamed. But he had an awakening of another sort. No bright sun blazed in at the open window to lift his heavy lids, and no morning bell from Saint-Sulpice opened his ears to the cheerful noise of the city. He awoke, gasping and staring in the dark, rolling face downward on the floor, catching his breath in agonized sobs, while through the window, from the streets, came a clamour of hoarse cries of pursuit and the noise of running men, a shouting and clatter, wherein here and there a voice was clear among the rest. "À l'assassin! Arrêtez!" He dragged himself to his feet in the dark, gasping still. What was this? All this? Again a dream? His legs trembled under him, and he sweated with fear. He made for the window, panting and feeble, and then, as he supported himself by the sill, he realized wonderingly that he was fully dressed, that he wore even his hat. The running crowd straggled through the outer street and away, the shouts growing fainter. What had awakened him? Why had he dressed? He remembered his matches, and turned to grope for them. But something was already in his hand. Something wet. Sticky. He dropped it on the table, and even as he struck the light, before he saw it, he knew. The match sputtered and flared, and there on the table lay the crooked dagger, smeared and dripping and horrible. Blood was on his hands, the match stuck in his fingers. Caught at the heart by the first grip of an awful surmise, he looked up and saw in the mirror before him, in the last flare of the match, the face of the thing in the room. You've been listening to a bite-sized audiobook, read by me, Simon Stanhope. If you enjoy these stories and would like to help me to keep producing new content, you can find links in the video description to my Patreon page, or to buy me a coffee. Another way to support me is through my Bandcamp page, bitesizedaudio.bandcamp.com, where you can hear my narrations of many more classic short stories, and you can also purchase and download them to keep. This recording is copyright Bitesized Audio 2024. Thank you for listening.